Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. I remember the exact moment it happened. I was walking back home, just a regular evening, when I turned the corner and saw nothing. Nothing at all. The familiar outline of my house, where I'd lived for years, had vanished. There was only an empty field, the kind that stretches for miles without a single tree or structure to break its monotony. At first, I thought I was disoriented. It was late, and the light was dim. Maybe I'd missed the turn. I walked around, looking for some clue, some sign that would tell me I was just in the wrong spot. But no! It was the right place. It had to be. I felt a strange unease spreading through me, a chill crawling up my spine. I stood there for what seemed like an eternity, unable to process what I was seeing, or rather, what I wasn't seeing. My house should have been right there. I could see it in my mind, the familiar porch, the cracked paint, the small garden I'd been too lazy to take care of for months. But it was all gone, as though it had never existed. A thought tugged at the edge of my mind. Maybe I had been drinking earlier and was too out of it to remember where I lived. But no, that wasn't it. I never drank to the point of not recognizing my own home. I took a few steps forward, my boots crunching on the dry grass underfoot. The emptiness around me felt suffocating. For the first time, I noticed how quiet it was. Not a single sound, not even a breeze. The world around me had become still, too still. My skin prickled, and a sense of dread settled heavily in my stomach. I couldn't bring myself to leave. I needed answers, so I started walking around the perimeter, hoping to find something that would explain this, some broken gate, some clue that would snap everything back to reality. But no, the field stretched on endlessly. No signs, no landmarks, nothing that could tell me where I had gone wrong. I found myself almost wishing for someone to come by, for some person to explain that I was just overreacting. But no one came. Not a soul in sight. Then, I saw something. A figure standing in the distance, just at the edge of the field. It was too far to make out clearly, but I knew instantly it wasn't a person. Not a real person. The figure was wrong, somehow. It looked distorted, like a blurry reflection in water. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as my thoughts scattered, 1,000 questions racing through my mind. Was it real? Was I losing my mind? I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, even as it seemed to slowly dissolve into the air, becoming nothing more than a smudge in the distance. A sharp noise snapped me out of my stupor. A loud, echoing creak from somewhere far behind me. I whipped around, but the field behind me was empty. No sound, no movement, just the oppressive silence. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. I turned back around, my pulse quickening. There was nothing. Just the field. The whisper came again, this time closer, unmistakable. My name. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring into the emptiness. But when I moved, my legs felt like lead, and every step I took felt wrong. The ground seemed to shift beneath me, warping, bending in ways I couldn't explain. As I made my way further into the field, the world seemed to stretch and shrink, distorting in ways that made me dizzy. I tried to call out, to scream for help, but no sound came from my mouth. The silence had swallowed everything. And then, just as I thought I might collapse from sheer confusion and terror, a shadow appeared just at the edge of my vision. It wasn't human, but it was moving towards me, and as it did, the field around me seemed to grow darker, more menacing. "Get out of my head," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But the shadow kept coming, and with it, the whispers grew louder. More voices joined in, all saying the same thing. "You never had a house." The words hit me like a physical blow. I blinked, and suddenly the field was gone. The figure, the whispers, everything disappeared. I was standing in the middle of a street. My street. But something was different. The houses were wrong, unfamiliar. And I was alone. I could hear my breath, ragged and quick, but that was the only sound in the air. Everything was wrong. It felt wrong. Like I was no longer where I was supposed to be. Where was my house? Where was I? The doubt gnawed at me, spreading like a virus. Had I lost my mind? Or was something else happening? In the distance, I could see a figure standing just beyond the corner of my street, watching me. And I knew, deep down, that I had to find out what was going on before I lost my mind completely. Before it was too late. I stumbled forward, my mind a blur, desperately trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. The street around me felt suffocating, yet strangely distant, as though it was fading into a place that didn't belong. The houses, the ones I had passed 100 times before, now seemed wrong. They were too perfect, too symmetrical, as if they had been pulled from a postcard. But it wasn't their appearance that disturbed me, it was the silence. Not a single light flickered from the windows. The houses weren't alive, they were simply empty shells, frozen in place. The air was thick, and every breath I took felt as though I was inhaling something that didn't belong to this world. My heart hammered in my chest as I moved along the sidewalk, the sensation of being watched only intensifying with each step. Where was everyone? I could feel my legs growing heavy, my footsteps almost echoing too loudly in the silence. I looked over my shoulder. No one. No cars. No pedestrians. Just an empty street stretching out ahead. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling that something was wrong with my memory. I could barely remember how I had gotten here. Was I walking home before? Wasn't I just in a field? I reached into my pocket for my phone. No signal. The screen flickered before going black, as though it had decided to give up on existing altogether. I tried to force it back to life, but nothing worked. The quiet, oppressive air around me grew heavier, like the world itself was holding its breath. I tried to calm myself. It's just nerves, I told myself. It's just stress from a long day. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew something wasn't right. I could feel it deep in my bones. It wasn't just nerves. As I turned the corner onto another street, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood at the far end of the block. I didn't know how I knew, but I knew it was the same one from the field. That thing. The one that wasn't quite human. It was standing motionless, too still, as though it was waiting for me. I froze, my feet glued to the ground. My heart skipped a beat. My throat went dry. It was too far to see clearly, but even at that distance, I could make out the shape of it, the silhouette was wrong. Its body was unnaturally tall and thin, its limbs long and twisted, as if they had been stretched beyond what was normal. I couldn't tell if it had a face or if the shadows just played tricks on me, but there was something in the way it stood, in the way it didn't move, that made my skin crawl. I took a step back, and it moved. Slowly. I should have run. I should have turned and sprinted away, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I couldn't look away. The figure seemed to glide toward me, its limbs jerking in unnatural motions, as though it was forcing itself into movement. The air thickened, the temperature dropped. I could feel my breath come out in invisible puffs, though it wasn't cold. Not physically. It was cold in a way that chilled my very soul, like the world around me was suddenly, violently out of place. Then I heard it again. The whisper. You never had a house. It was the same voice from the field, soft but clear, reverberating in the back of my skull. I clenched my hands into fists, trying to shake the words out of my head, but they wouldn't leave. They kept repeating over and over, and with each repetition, the figure got closer. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't stay here. I had to get away from whatever this was. I had to escape. I turned and ran. My legs finally responded, but the further I went, the harder it was to see. The world around me seemed to bend and warp. The streetlights flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows across the ground, and the houses on either side of the street began to blur. The asphalt felt uneven beneath my feet, like the ground itself was shifting. I looked back once, just once. The figure was no longer standing where it had been. It was closer. Much closer. I could hear its footsteps now, long, dragging, scraping the ground. The noise was wrong, not a regular sound, but something that tore at the edges of reality. I turned the corner onto the next block, my pulse pounding in my ears, the sound of my own breath too loud. I pushed forward, the streets becoming increasingly unfamiliar, more twisted. Nothing looked like it should. The world around me was starting to distort, bending like paper in a storm, each building now seeming to lean toward me, as though the houses themselves were watching. I stopped at a crossroad, panting, hands on my knees. I didn't know where to go anymore. The figure was still coming. I needed help, but there was no one. Not a single person in sight. There was no one but me, and whatever was following. The whispering was louder now, clearer. You never had a house. The words echoed, reverberated, rattling in my skull. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I looked up, and I saw it again. The house. My house. But it wasn't the house I remembered. It looked wrong. The walls were dark, the windows too still. The door was ajar, but there was no light coming from inside. The porch that once felt like home now looked like a gaping mouth ready to swallow me whole. I stepped closer, each footfall heavier than the last. I wanted to believe this was real. I wanted to believe that everything was just a bad dream, but the more I stared at the house, the less it made sense. I reached out for the door, my hand trembling as it gripped the handle. It was cold. I opened it. And then I heard it again. You never had a house. The whisper wasn't coming from the air anymore. It was coming from inside the house. I pushed the door open, and the darkness inside swallowed me whole. My heart was racing, pounding against my chest as though it wanted to escape, but my feet refused to move. The hallway before me stretched endlessly, dimly lit by flickering lights that cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. The air inside the house was thick and musty, a heavy smell of mildew and something else I couldn't place, something metallic, almost like rust. I took a hesitant step forward, the floor creaking under my weight. The sound echoed in the stillness, like the house was listening, watching. It felt alive, but not in the way a home should. This place wasn't comforting, it wasn't familiar. It felt like it was waiting for me to make a mistake, to do something wrong. I didn't know what I was looking for, or why I had even come inside. But my legs moved on their own, carrying me deeper into the house. The walls seemed to close in around me, the ceiling lowering with each step I took. The house felt too small now, too cramped, as though it was suffocating me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears. The whispering was louder now. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, many voices, all overlapping, all saying the same thing, each one more urgent than the last. You never had a house. I tried to block them out. I tried to ignore them, to focus on anything else, but it was impossible. The voices were everywhere, inside my head, behind me, beneath my feet, echoing through the walls. They were closing in, pressing on me like the house itself was collapsing around me. I reached the living room, if you could call it that. It was empty, save for the furniture, but it was all wrong. The chairs were out of place, turned at angles, and the table in the center of the room, my table, I remembered it well, was now covered in dust, the surface scratched and warped as if it had been abandoned for years. And yet, I could feel it. The faintest trace of warmth. The soft, almost imperceptible feeling that something, or someone, had been here just moments before. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my mind too foggy to think clearly. Something in the corner of the room caught my eye. A small, old mirror. It was framed in dark wood, the glass clouded with years of neglect. I didn't know why, but I found myself walking toward it, drawn to it in a way I couldn't explain. I reached out and touched the surface, my fingers brushing lightly against the glass. For a brief moment, the room seemed to shift. The shadows in the mirror warped, as if they were alive, moving just outside the edges of the reflection. I pulled my hand back quickly, but it was too late. I saw something, no, someone, in the reflection. It was me, but not the me I recognized. The figure in the mirror was twisted, distorted, a pale version of myself with hollow eyes and a twisted grin stretching too wide across my face. It wasn't real. I knew it wasn't real. It couldn't be. But my breath hitched in my throat, my vision blurring as I stepped back, trying to shake the image from my mind. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. You never had a house. The voice was coming from everywhere now. The walls. The floor. The mirror. I slammed my eyes shut, clutching my head in my hands. The pressure in my skull was unbearable. I could feel it, something pushing against my mind, against my thoughts. Trying to erase me. Trying to make me forget everything I knew. No, this isn't real, I told myself, over and over. This is just in my head. It's not real. But when I opened my eyes, the room was no longer the same. The furniture was gone, replaced by shadows that seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes I couldn't comprehend. The walls were bleeding. Dark, red streaks ran down from the ceiling, pooling at the edges of the floor like something out of a nightmare. I staggered back, my mind reeling. The mirror was gone, replaced by a black void that seemed to suck in the light around it. The air was suffocating, thick with a sense of dread. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then I heard it. A sound like footsteps. Heavy. Dragging. Slow. Coming from behind me. I whipped around, my heart racing. The hallway was empty, but the sound kept coming, getting closer, louder, the thump of footsteps reverberating through the floorboards. It's not real, I repeated in my head, but the words felt hollow now. I turned back to the doorway, wanting nothing more than to escape, but the doorframe was gone. The hallway had vanished, replaced by an endless void stretching out into darkness. I was trapped. A shadow moved in the distance, growing larger, taking shape. I could hear it now, the scraping of its feet, dragging across the floor, inching closer and closer. My pulse quickened, my breath caught in my throat. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, caught in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. And then I saw it. The figure. It wasn't the same as before. This one was taller, its limbs longer, more unnatural. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a mass of shifting shadows, no features, just darkness. But it was there. It was real. It was standing in the doorway, staring at me. And then I heard it. The voice. You never had a house. I tried to scream. I tried to shout, to run, to do anything. But the words wouldn't come. The fear choked me, held me in place. And then everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. It could have been seconds or hours. Time felt like it no longer existed, as though I had fallen into a world where nothing had any meaning. When I opened my eyes, everything was blurry at first, just a haze of dark shapes and twisted shadows. The air was heavy, thick with the same suffocating feeling from before. I tried to move, but my body felt sluggish, as though I was dragging myself through wet concrete. My fingers twitched, and I could feel the rough texture of the floor beneath me, the coldness of it seeping into my skin. My chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, but even as I gasped for air, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to sit up, my mind swirling, heart still racing. The room I was in was no longer the living room I had seen before. This place, it felt wrong, like I had stepped into a parallel version of my own house. The walls were cracked, the paint peeling in long, jagged strips. The once cozy furniture was now broken, splintered into pieces, scattered across the floor. The air smelled of damp wood and mold, and the quiet was unnerving, thick with the echoes of something I couldn't quite understand. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs unsteady, but I didn't care. I needed to get out of this place. I needed to find the door, the exit, anything that could lead me back to reality. I staggered across the room, my eyes scanning the corners, the shadows, half expecting something to jump out at me. The whispering had stopped, but its absence left an even deeper sense of dread. It was as though the silence was waiting for something, a prelude to an impending storm. I reached the hallway and paused, my hand gripping the splintered doorframe. The shadows in the hallway seemed to pulse, shifting and stretching like living things, crawling along the walls. I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if the house itself was changing. I needed to keep moving. There was no choice. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to escape, but my legs were too weak to carry me quickly. I stumbled down the hallway, the creaking floorboards beneath my feet sounding too loud, too obvious in the silence. I passed by rooms, empty, hollow rooms where the wallpaper had peeled away in long strips, revealing the bare wood beneath. But the strangest thing? The further I walked, the more the house seemed to stretch, as if it was expanding, growing bigger with each step I took. I was walking in circles. I couldn't explain it, but every hallway I turned down led me back to the same place. The same walls, the same peeling paint. The rooms were like a maze, one that kept twisting and folding into itself. Panic started to build again. My breath grew shallow, my chest tightening as the oppressive air seemed to close in around me. I touched the walls, the cold, rough texture of the peeling wallpaper grounding me for a moment. I had to focus. I had to find the exit. But then, I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, through a gap in the warped wood, a door. The door was different, more solid than the others. It was made of heavy, dark wood, its surface smooth, almost gleaming in the dim light. It looked familiar. I couldn't place it, but I knew it. It was the door to my house. I stumbled toward it, each step bringing me closer to what I hoped was an escape. My fingers brushed against the brass handle, and for a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief. I could feel my body relaxing, just slightly, the panic in my chest giving way to the hope of getting out. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. But what I saw on the other side froze me in place. It wasn't the outside. It wasn't the world I had known. The door opened into another hallway, a different hallway, but it was the same. The same cracked walls, the same peeling wallpaper. It was like stepping into a reflection of the hallway I had just walked through, only this one was darker, colder. I blinked, trying to process what was happening, but the door was still open. The room on the other side was dark, and I could see nothing beyond the threshold. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I stepped back, heart pounding. I closed the door, but as I did, the sound started again. The dragging steps. Someone, or something, was moving in the other hallway, getting closer, closer. My breath hitched, my pulse spiking again as I pressed my back against the door, too afraid to turn around. The footsteps were getting louder, the scraping sound closer, now unmistakable. It was real. Something was out there. And it was coming for me. I didn't know what to do. There was no escape. The house, my house, was turning into something else, something alien, something I couldn't recognize. I could feel it in the air, in the walls, in every creak and groan of the floor beneath me. This was no longer the place I had once called home. I had to get out. But every door I opened, every hallway I walked down, led me back to the same place. I was trapped. Trapped in a house that didn't exist. The footsteps stopped. I didn't dare move. I barely even breathed. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick. And then I heard the whisper again. You never had a house. I looked around, but there was no one. No figure, no shadow. Just the emptiness of the hallway, the distortion in the air, as though it was waiting for something I couldn't understand. I tried to take another step forward, but I felt something tug at my sleeve. A cold hand. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran, turning into the nearest room. My feet thudded against the floor, my chest burning from the effort, but every time I thought I had found an exit, I turned another corner, and there it was again. The same hallway. The same door. The same emptiness. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep this up. My mind was unraveling, the world around me no longer feeling real. It felt like I was living in someone else's nightmare, trapped in a place that existed only to torment me. I had to wake up. I had to get out. I could feel the coldness on my skin, the air in the house turning frigid, almost biting. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the atmosphere itself, pressing against me, suffocating me. I had no idea how long I had been running, or how many times I had looped through the same hallway, opening door after door, only to find myself back where I started. The house had become a twisted labyrinth, a nightmare where the walls were closing in on me, each step forward taking me deeper into its grip. The shadows that lined the walls seemed to move of their own accord now, not just stretching but twisting, forming shapes that I couldn't quite make out. They were mocking me, growing larger and more oppressive with every passing second. And the sound, the footsteps, were louder, closer, dragging across the floor like a relentless force, getting nearer with every heartbeat. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, pulsing with some kind of dark energy. I stumbled through another door, my fingers scraping against the handle. This time, the room was different. Or rather, it wasn't a room at all. It was a vast, empty space, a void, stretching out endlessly in all directions. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they were all gone. There was only the darkness, an all-consuming blackness that swallowed everything in its path. It felt like I had fallen off the edge of the world, into some kind of purgatory, where nothing existed except for me, and whatever was following me. I spun around, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the shadows were still there, closing in from every angle, creeping along the edges of the empty space. There was no escape. No way out. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I felt the walls closing in, though I could see nothing around me. It was as if the house had become a part of me, like my fear had twisted the very fabric of reality. And then I heard it again. The whispering. You never had a house. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a low, guttural growl resonating deep in my chest, as though the very air was vibrating with it. It was everywhere now, all around me, inside my head, clawing at my sanity. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound didn't stop. It only grew louder, more insistent. You never had a house. I shook my head violently, trying to block out the words, but they drilled into my skull over and over, like a mantra. I stumbled backward, my vision blurring, the ground beneath me shifting. The darkness seemed to pulse with each breath I took, the shadows growing darker, more solid, as if they were reaching for me, pulling me in. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to get out. I had to wake up. I spun around again, desperate for some sign of a door, a window, anything that could lead me out of this nightmare. My eyes scanned the void, but there was nothing. Nothing but the endless blackness and the twisting shadows that were now right in front of me. I felt a presence behind me, cold breath on my neck, the unmistakable sensation of something or someone standing just inches away. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as if the very space around me was being compressed. I didn't dare turn around. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears as the footsteps approached. Slow, deliberate, like they were savoring each moment, each step bringing them closer to me. It's not real. It's not real, I repeated to myself, my mind desperately grasping for any shred of rational thought. This isn't real. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were right behind me now, the sound of dragging feet sending chills down my spine. I felt the cold breath again, this time brushing against my ear, sending a wave of panic through me. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I had to face it. I had to face whatever was coming. I turned around slowly, dread creeping up my spine as I forced myself to look. The thing standing before me was not human. Not even close. It was tall, taller than any person should be, its limbs too long, too thin. Its skin was pale, almost gray, like it hadn't seen the sun in years. Its face was the most unsettling part. It wasn't a face at all, not really. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless surface, as if its face had been erased. It was wrong. So wrong. The thing tilted its head, its movements jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Its body rippled with shadows, like it was both there and not there, existing in two places at once. And then it spoke. You never had a house. The words weren't just spoken. They were felt. They reverberated in my chest, in my bones, shaking the very core of my being. My heart slammed against my ribcage, my breath coming in desperate gasps. This thing, this creature, was the house. It was everything. It was real. And it had been waiting for me. I took a step back, my mind racing. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But it was. I tried to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, trapped by the thing before me, the thing that didn't belong. The thing that had been erasing me from existence. You never had a house. The whispering came again, louder now, shaking the air around me. I felt my mind slipping. My grip on reality was slipping. Was this real? Or was it all just in my head? The shadows reached out for me. I could feel them now, cold, like tendrils wrapping around my limbs, pulling me toward the thing. You never had a house. I wanted to fight. I wanted to scream. But all I could do was fall. I don't know when it started, but the first message I found wasn't too alarming. At least, that's what I tried to convince myself. It was a text message from my phone, sent to an old friend of mine, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. The text was simple, nothing strange about it at first glance. It was just a "Hey, how have you been?" But I never sent it. I was sure of that. In fact, I didn't even remember thinking about reaching out to him. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to understand how it had happened. Maybe I had sent it without realizing? No. I would have remembered that. Besides, I hadn't been thinking about him in ages. He had faded into the background of my life, like so many others. It felt like my heart skipped a beat as I glanced at the timestamp, 2 days ago. I hadn't touched my phone in that time, not even once. The idea of me unknowingly sending messages to people from my past began to settle uncomfortably in my chest. My fingers trembled as I deleted the message and tossed the phone onto the couch. But that wasn't the last one. The second message came the very next day. Again, it was to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Anna, an ex-colleague I'd lost touch with after I left my old job. This time, the text was a little more unsettling. It read, "I'm sorry for everything. It wasn't your fault." I froze. I didn't remember ever needing to apologize to Anna. We had parted ways amicably, no bad blood, nothing unresolved. I hadn't thought of her in months, maybe even longer. So why would I send her a message like that? And, more importantly, why did my phone show that I had? I hadn't written it, at least not consciously. The thoughts didn't even seem to belong to me. With a sigh, I opened the message and checked the timestamp. Same thing. 2 days ago. My stomach churned. I paced back and forth, the floor creaking beneath my weight. Something wasn't right. This couldn't be a glitch. People don't just send messages from your phone without you knowing it. The idea of someone taking control of my device, of me, sent a wave of nausea through me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Anna's name in my mind, the words "I'm sorry for everything" echoing in my thoughts. My mind kept racing, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Was it some strange accident? A forgotten moment? Or something darker? My phone vibrated on the table, and I jumped. I hadn't expected a notification so late. I grabbed it, my fingers almost numb from the anxiety that was steadily growing inside me. A new message. This one was from someone even more unexpected. Mark, my old roommate from college, a guy I hadn't seen in almost 4 years. His name flashed on the screen, and I hesitated before opening it. The message was chilling. You don't remember, do you? I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I reread the words. What did he mean by that? What didn't I remember? I hadn't spoken to Mark in ages, and now he was sending me cryptic messages? And it wasn't just the text itself, it was the way it seemed so knowing. As though he knew something I didn't. I stared at the screen for a long time, the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. Why were these messages coming now? Why from people I barely remembered? Was I losing control? Or was someone else pulling the strings? The message from Mark echoed in my mind, reverberating against the walls of my skull like a constant, intrusive hum. I couldn't shake it. You don't remember, do you? The words were a riddle, a puzzle I didn't want to solve but couldn't ignore. My fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating. Part of me wanted to respond, to ask him what the hell he meant, to demand an explanation. But a deeper, more unsettling feeling held me back. What if I didn't want to know the truth? What if my mind was trying to bury something dark, something better left forgotten? I put the phone down, but it was no use. The fear was already burrowing under my skin, spreading through my body like a poison. I couldn't stop thinking about it. There had to be a reason. Was it some kind of prank? A sick joke? Or had someone hacked my phone, sending messages to people from my past just to mess with me? But then, why would they include Mark? He wasn't the type to joke around like that. I stood up and paced around the living room, the soft click of my shoes on the hardwood floor sounding louder than usual, like the house itself was echoing my unease. I could feel my mind unraveling, piece by piece. I needed answers. I needed to know if I was losing my grip on reality or if something far worse was happening. But where could I start? That's when I saw it. On the table in front of me, beneath a pile of scattered papers, was my old journal. I hadn't opened it in years. It had sat there, forgotten, gathering dust. But something about its presence in that moment, felt important. A nagging sensation told me it was connected to all of this, that it held the key to unlocking whatever was happening to me. I reached for it, my hands trembling slightly as I flipped it open to the first page. The handwriting was mine, but it looked foreign to me now. Each word, each sentence, seemed as if it had been written by someone else. I scanned through the entries, each one more unsettling than the last. The journal chronicled parts of my life I had long buried, disconnected memories, places I'd been, people I'd met. But what stood out was the tone. It was as if I had been writing to someone, a specific person, and I couldn't remember who that person was. As I flipped through the pages, my eyes caught something that made my stomach drop. It was a note I had written years ago, one I had completely forgotten about. The words on the page read, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. But it's too late now. I have to keep going. I have to forget." What did it mean? Who had I been apologizing to? And why couldn't I remember writing it? I couldn't make sense of it. The more I read, the more I felt like I was sinking into a pit of confusion, as if I was being pulled deeper into a reality I couldn't control. I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking violently. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. That's when the phone rang. I stared at the screen, my heart skipping a beat. The caller ID was unfamiliar, an unlisted number. I had a sinking feeling in my gut that I already knew who it was. I didn't answer. Instead, I let the call go to voicemail. The beep sounded in the quiet room, like a countdown to something inevitable. I waited, holding my breath, knowing I had to listen to whatever message was about to be left. The voice that came through was soft at first, almost a whisper. It was too familiar. Too real. "You still don't remember, do you?" The voice paused. "It's not too late. You can still fix it. You just have to come back." My blood ran cold. The message was chilling, but it wasn't just the words. It was the voice. I knew that voice. I couldn't place it at first, but then it hit me. It was Mark's voice, the same voice that had sent the text earlier. How could he be calling me now? How could he know what was happening? And then I realized something even more horrifying. The voice wasn't just from the voicemail. It was also in my head. Like an echo. Like a memory that wasn't mine. The more I thought about it, the more I could hear it, clearer now. It wasn't just the voicemail anymore. It was everywhere. I had to get to the bottom of this. But how? What was happening to me? Was someone toying with me, or was I unraveling from the inside out? I reached for my phone to check for any other messages, to see if there was anything new, anything that could help me make sense of this madness. But before I could unlock it, I froze. There was a new notification. A text. From Anna. I opened it without thinking, my breath catching in my throat as I read the message. "It's too late for you now. You'll see." The text from Anna blurred before my eyes. "It's too late for you now. You'll see." The words twisted in my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to focus. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it, but the more I thought, the more my mind seemed to fray. Anna had never been cryptic, never spoken in riddles. She was practical, logical, someone I could rely on. But this message, it felt like a warning, like she knew something I didn't. I didn't know how much longer I could stand this feeling, the slow erosion of my reality. My phone felt foreign in my hands, an object I didn't trust. But something about it, something deeper, pulled me to it again. The phone seemed to be calling me, the vibrations like a heartbeat in my palm. I sat on the edge of the couch, my eyes still fixed on the message, trying to decipher its meaning. Why would Anna say something like that? Why would she suddenly turn on me, especially when I hadn't done anything wrong? I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the rising panic in my chest. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone had gotten hold of her phone and sent it to me. But that theory fell apart as soon as my phone buzzed again. Another message. I unlocked the screen, almost afraid to see who it was this time. The name that appeared was more chilling than any of the others. It was mine. From me. I felt a jolt run through me, something sharp and cold, like an electric shock to my system. This couldn't be real. How could I possibly receive a message from myself? I hadn't sent anything, not consciously. My mind was racing, my thoughts scattered as I opened the message, bracing myself for whatever was inside. I'm sorry. It's too late. I didn't want to, but now there's no turning back. The words twisted inside me like a knife. I didn't want to believe it, but the fear in my gut was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a strange occurrence, it was happening again. I was losing control. The line between what was real and what wasn't was blurring more every second. I set the phone down, trying to calm myself. Maybe there was some rational explanation. Maybe I had sent these messages in my sleep or during some kind of fugue state. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, something deep inside told me that I was lying to myself. Something was wrong, so wrong, and it was only getting worse. I needed answers. I couldn't let this continue. The idea of someone playing some sick joke on me didn't seem plausible anymore. This was real. This was happening to me, and whatever it was intentional. Someone was doing this. Someone wanted me to feel like I was losing my mind. I grabbed my coat and headed out the door, the cold air biting at my skin as soon as I stepped outside. I needed to talk to someone, anyone. Maybe seeing another person, hearing their voice, would help me ground myself again. But even as I walked through the streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't alone. The silence around me seemed unnatural, almost oppressive, like the world itself had fallen still. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and quickened my pace. The streets I'd known for years were now unfamiliar, distorted by the haze of paranoia and confusion. Every shadow seemed to hold something in it, every sound felt like a warning. I could hear the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves in the wind, but they felt far away, disconnected from reality. It was like I was in a dream, only it wasn't the kind of dream where you wake up. I didn't know how long I walked, lost in my thoughts, but eventually, I found myself standing outside an old cafe, a place I used to frequent. It felt like a safe haven, a familiar memory, and that's exactly why I came here. I needed something, anything, to remind me of who I was before this all started. I pushed open the door, the bell above it chiming softly. The smell of freshly brewed coffee hit me, comforting and ordinary, as I stepped inside. But the moment I crossed the threshold, I froze. There, sitting at one of the tables near the window, was Anna. My heart stopped for a beat. She looked the same, her dark hair, the way she always tucked a strand behind her ear when she was deep in thought. But there was something about her, something off. It wasn't the usual warmth in her eyes. It was cold, distant, almost like she wasn't even there. I approached her cautiously, my footsteps louder than they should have been in the quiet cafe. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. "Anna?" I said, my voice sounding strange in the air. She didn't react. I took another step forward, my pulse quickening. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but the moment my fingers brushed against her, she turned to face me. Her eyes, dark, hollow, and filled with a fear that mirrored my own, stared at me for a long moment before she finally spoke. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. You shouldn't have come. My throat tightened. What do you mean? What's going on? Why did you send that message? Anna stood up slowly, her movements unnatural, like she was moving through thick water. She took a step back, and then another, as if trying to distance herself from me. You don't remember, do you? She said, her voice breaking with a strange, almost mechanical quality. You can't remember what you did. I felt a chill seep into my bones as I took a step toward her. What did I do? What's happening to me? To all of us? She looked past me, her gaze unfocused, as though she was seeing something I couldn't. It's already started, she whispered. There's no going back now. And then she was gone, vanished into thin air, as if she had never been there at all. The room around me spun. The smell of coffee, the quiet hum of the cafe, everything started to fade, slipping away like sand through my fingers. The last thing I heard was my own voice, the one that felt less like mine and more like a stranger's. It's too late now. The world around me twisted like a broken mirror. One moment, I was standing in the cafe, eyes locked on the spot where Anna had just been, and the next, I was alone. Empty tables, untouched cups, and the faint smell of stale coffee filled the air. The bell above the door jingled as I stood frozen in place, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I blinked, hoping to find some explanation, some hint that everything I had just experienced was just a hallucination, a fever dream. But no! The silence was deafening. The lights buzzed faintly above me, and the air felt heavy, pressing on me from all sides. I stepped forward, my legs shaky, feeling my mind unravel with each passing second. Was it real? Had she really been there? Had I imagined it all? But no! I knew the answer. I had seen her, heard her voice. I wasn't losing my mind, at least, not entirely. Something was happening, something beyond my control, something I couldn't explain. I pushed open the cafe door, the chill of the outside air hitting me like a slap. The street, which just moments ago had felt familiar, now seemed like an alien landscape. It wasn't just the emptiness, the void where Anna had been, it was the stillness. Not a single person in sight. The usual hum of traffic was absent, the distant conversations of pedestrians nowhere to be heard. It felt like the world had stopped, like I was trapped in a bubble where nothing moved except for me. I pulled out my phone again, desperate to make sense of it all. But as soon as I looked at the screen, my heart sank. The message for myself was still there, the words still haunting me. I'm sorry. It's too late. I didn't want to, but now there's no turning back. Was it a warning? Or was it just another piece of this twisted puzzle I couldn't solve? I tried to block out the rising panic in my chest, to force my thoughts into some sort of rational order. I needed to find answers. But where could I even begin? The sound of footsteps behind me made me spin around. I expected to see someone, anyone, but there was nothing. Just the cold, empty street stretching out before me. The footsteps had stopped. Or maybe I had imagined them. It was hard to tell anymore. I walked faster now, my steps quickening as I pushed forward, determined to escape the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting to pounce. Every corner I turned, every alley I passed, seemed to twist in on itself. The world didn't make sense anymore. The buildings, the streetlights, even the air, it all felt wrong, like I was trapped in some half-formed nightmare. And then it happened again. The phone buzzed in my pocket, the vibration so forceful it startled me. I pulled it out, already dreading what I might find. The screen was cracked, a long, jagged line slicing through the glass, but the message was clear. You're not real. I couldn't breathe. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the screen. This time, the message wasn't from Anna, or Mark, or even from me. It was from someone else. I looked around, as if expecting to see the sender standing right in front of me, but there was nothing. Just the distant hum of an empty world. A world that felt increasingly alien to me. Who was doing this? Who was sending these messages? And why did it feel like they were watching me, always just one step ahead, pulling the strings of my reality like some twisted puppet master? I gripped my phone tightly, forcing myself to focus. The world around me was disintegrating, but I couldn't let it break me. Not yet. I needed to find someone who could help, someone who could explain what was happening. I knew where I had to go. I turned down the street and headed for Mark's apartment. He was the only one who had reached out to me in this whole mess, the only one who seemed to know something. But as I walked, my footsteps grew heavier, slower. The air seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. Every corner, every turn felt wrong. I wanted to run, to flee from whatever nightmare I had stepped into, but I couldn't. I had to know what was happening. I had to confront it. I reached Mark's apartment building just as the last light of day began to fade. The lobby was dark, lit only by the dull glow of a single overhead light. It felt like a ghost town. No one was there. I called out, but my voice bounced off the walls, falling flat in the eerie quiet. I stepped toward the elevator, the doors opening without a sound. The metal car inside was empty, waiting for me. I stepped in, and as the doors slid shut behind me, a thought crossed my mind, an unsettling one. What if Mark was no longer here? What if the apartment, the building, had already changed? The elevator moved upward, its slow, mechanical hum filling the silence. But as the floors ticked by, something shifted. The air inside the car grew colder, the lights flickering for a moment, and then I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it grew louder with each passing second. You shouldn't have come here. The words sent a cold shiver down my spine. I whipped my head around, but the elevator was empty. There was no one behind me. No one in front of me. I reached for the emergency button, but before I could press it, the elevator jolted to a stop. The lights flickered once more, and then nothing. The world outside the elevator seemed to vanish entirely. The silence was deafening. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, I heard the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps. Someone was coming. And I knew, with terrifying certainty, that I wasn't going to like who I was about to meet. The footsteps grew louder, echoing in the confined space of the elevator. Each step was deliberate, slow, but unmistakable. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, my pulse drumming in my ears. There was no doubt now. Someone was coming for me. The elevator was a cage. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. I pressed myself against the back wall, my breath shallow and ragged. I wasn't sure who, or what, was coming for me, but everything inside me screamed to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The light flickered again. The hum of the elevator's machinery stopped abruptly. The world outside seemed to vanish completely, swallowed by the crushing silence. I could feel the weight of something heavy, something looming just beyond my reach, waiting in the dark. Who's there? I wanted to shout the question, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth was dry, my throat tight, as if something was pressing against it from the inside. The steps grew nearer. The air felt colder, colder than it had any right to be. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself for warmth, but there was none. The temperature had dropped to an almost unbearable chill, and yet it wasn't the cold that was scaring me. It was the presence. The unmistakable sense that something was standing right behind me, just out of sight. I could feel it, the weight of its gaze, like fingers brushing against my neck, waiting for the moment to reach out and... The elevator jolted violently, throwing me off balance. I grabbed the railing, barely catching myself as the world around me tilted. The walls groaned, and for a heartbeat, I thought the whole thing might collapse, trapping me in the dark with whatever was in here with me. The elevator came to a sudden, jolting halt, throwing me back against the wall with a sharp breath. The door in front of me opened. A crack, just enough to see the floor ahead. The hallway was dim, the lights overhead flickering erratically. But it was the figure that caught my eye. It was standing just outside the elevator. I didn't need to see more. I already knew who it was. It was me. Not exactly. Not in the way I knew myself. This figure was distorted. Its eyes were too wide, too dark, as if they had swallowed all light. The figure had my face, but it wasn't me. There was something fundamentally wrong about it. Its mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin, jagged and twisted, and its movements were stiff, jerky, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The thing in front of me, it was me, but it was wrong. It was off. It was everything I feared, everything I had tried to avoid, and now it was standing in front of me, watching me with those wide, dark eyes. A cold laugh escaped from its mouth, a sound that wasn't human. It echoed through the empty hallway, filling the space with a sound that made my skin crawl. The thing didn't move toward me, but I could feel it. It was coming for me. The thing was me, but it wasn't. And I didn't know which one of us was real. "You've made a mistake," it said, its voice low, warped, like someone speaking through water. It was my voice, but distorted, like a recording that had been played too many times, warped and twisted with every repetition. I took a shaky step back, my pulse racing. My thoughts were a blur. My mind screamed to run, but I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't cooperate. The thing, it took a step forward, its movements unsettling, too smooth, too wrong. It was mimicking me, but in a way that sent ripples of terror through my bones. I could feel my heart pounding harder with each step it took. It wasn't moving toward me like a person would. It was gliding, sliding along the floor, like it was being dragged forward, not walking at all. "You're not real," it repeated, its eyes narrowing, the smile widening impossibly. "None of this is real. You can't escape. Not now." The words were like a blow to my chest. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but I couldn't find the strength to do anything but stare, rooted to the spot, frozen by fear. The figure reached toward me, its hand, my hand, outstretched, fingers curling into something that was almost human, but not quite. I gasped, feeling something cold, icy, sink into the pit of my stomach as I tried to back away. But it was too late. The moment it touched me, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Time had no meaning in that space. I woke up to the sound of my own voice, but it was muffled, distant. I blinked, trying to focus, trying to make sense of what had happened. I was lying on the floor of the elevator, the doors open wide, the hallway beyond empty once again. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. My chest felt tight, my throat dry. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that I had changed. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I had come back from it. But as I stumbled into the hallway, there was no sign of the figure. The lights were flickering overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward me. I could hear the hum of the building's old pipes, the faint sound of wind rattling through the cracks in the windows. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I unlocked the screen. The messages were still there. But there was one new message. You never left. You were always here. I felt my stomach twist as I stared at the words, the reality of them sinking in. The message didn't make sense. But maybe that's exactly the point. Maybe I had never left. Maybe I had never truly been here at all. The world around me began to blur again. Every evening, as darkness falls, I see them. A group of children playing in the yard, their laughter echoing in the still air. But when I move closer, when I step outside the door or peek through the window, they vanish. Not a sound, not a whisper, just a cold emptiness where they had been moments before. Are they real? I've asked myself that question 100 times, each time with less certainty. The first time it happened, I thought it was a trick of the light, some fleeting image my mind conjured in the quiet of dusk. But it happened again the next night. And again. And again. It's always the same, about 3 or 4 of them, too young to be out alone at night. They run and laugh, chasing each other, their shadows stretching long in the evening light. Their clothes are tattered, their faces pale and drawn. They never speak. They never acknowledge me when I call to them. They just turn, their hollow eyes locking onto mine, and then they're gone. I've tried to get closer, to see if I could touch one of them, shake them awake from whatever nightmare they're trapped in. But each time I step out of the door, they slip away like smoke. They vanish into thin air, leaving nothing behind but the echo of their laughter fading into the night. It's hard to ignore them when they seem so real. The laughter, the footsteps, the way they move, it's all too lifelike. But there's something off about them, something that makes my skin crawl when I think about it. It's in the way they stare at me with those wide, unblinking eyes, as if they're waiting for something. Waiting for me to understand. Every night, I sit at the window, watching them, wondering if this will be the night they come closer. But every time I try to move toward them, they disappear. I know something's wrong. I can feel it in my gut. But the question is, why won't they leave me alone? And why do they keep coming back? I've stopped telling people about them. At first, I tried to explain to my friends, to family, but no one believes me. They say I'm imagining things, that it's just my mind playing tricks on me. But I know what I saw. I know what I keep seeing. They're out there, in the yard. I can hear them. Their laughter. The sound of their footsteps. It's always there, echoing through the silence of the night. I can't shake the feeling that they're watching me, waiting for me to do something. I tried to take a picture once. I grabbed my phone, aimed it at the yard, and pressed the shutter. But when I looked at the screen, the image was empty. Just the yard, with no sign of the children. It was like they had never been there at all. It's only when I step away from the window, when I close my eyes for just a second, that I hear them again. Their laughter, soft and eerie, rising from somewhere near the trees. The worst part is when I wake up in the middle of the night and see their faces in my dreams. Always the same ones. Those pale, expressionless faces staring at me, waiting. I can't tell if they want something from me or if they're just trapped in this strange limbo between worlds, unable to find peace. Either way, they won't leave me alone. And I don't think they ever will. The nights have grown longer, the shadows stretching deeper into the corners of my mind. It's been over a week now, and each evening, without fail, the children return. I've tried to ignore them, tried to convince myself that they're nothing more than figments of my imagination, tricks my tired eyes play on me. But every night, their presence becomes more real. It started with simple things. A whisper of laughter, soft and high-pitched, carried on the wind. Then the sound of tiny feet scurrying across the yard. At first, I'd rush to the window, only to see nothing, just the empty, silent space where they should have been. The yard, once a place of comfort, has turned into a place of dread. Last night, though, something changed. I don't know what prompted me to do it, but I decided to step outside. Maybe it was the sheer weight of the silence that was pressing against my chest, or maybe it was the eerie sense of familiarity that I could no longer ignore. I wanted to see them up close, to prove to myself that they were just children playing in the dark. Nothing more. I opened the door slowly, careful not to make a sound, as if any sudden movement would shatter the fragile illusion of safety I'd built inside. My bare feet touched the cool ground, and I stepped out into the yard. For a moment, nothing. Just the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze and the far-off call of an owl. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Everything seemed normal, too normal. Then, I heard it. A giggle. Soft, almost musical. Then another. And another. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There, just at the edge of the trees, were the children. Four of them this time, just like before. They were standing in a circle, their backs to me, their small heads bent as if they were whispering to each other. Their clothes, ragged and torn, fluttered gently in the night air. I felt a chill run down my spine as I took a cautious step forward. The sound of my foot scraping against the gravel seemed deafening in the stillness. They didn't react. Not at first. I took another step, then another. Still, nothing. I called out, my voice trembling. Hey, are you all right? They didn't respond. Their heads remained lowered, their bodies unmoving. A cold shiver crept up my neck, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something was wrong, something had changed. I tried to take another step forward, but my foot caught on something. Looking down, I saw a small, broken toy, a doll, its face cracked and smeared with dirt. I don't know why, but the sight of it made my breath catch in my throat. I bent down, reaching out to touch it, and that's when I heard it. The soft scrape of footsteps. I whipped around, heart racing. They were closer now. The children stood in a line, their small, pale faces staring directly at me. Their eyes, wide, empty, unblinking, were fixed on me, as though they were waiting for something. Their mouths twitched, ever so slightly, but they didn't speak. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but something held me in place. The air around me had grown thick, as if the very atmosphere had turned to molasses. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own rapid breaths. My legs felt weak, and my mind was racing. I took a step back, then another. But the children didn't move. They just stood there, staring at me with those dark, empty eyes. Then, one of them, there was no way to tell which, raised a hand. It was slow, deliberate, as if the child were trying to get my attention. I felt a pang of fear deep in my chest. And then, the voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even a whisper. It was a soft, drawn-out murmur that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Come play with us. I didn't know what to do. My body was frozen, but my mind was screaming at me to run. I took another step back, then another. And then, before I could react, they were gone. Just like that. In the blink of an eye, they vanished into the night, leaving nothing behind but the faintest scent of something cold and damp, like the earth after a heavy rain. I stood there for what felt like hours, my mind spinning, my heart hammering in my chest. The children were gone, but the unease lingered, hanging in the air like a dark cloud. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what they want or why they keep coming back. But I can't shake the feeling that they're waiting for me to make the next move. They want something. I just don't know it yet. And I'm afraid to find out. I didn't sleep that night. Not a wink. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, those empty, staring faces, their silent eyes haunting me from the corners of my mind. Every whisper of wind seemed like their voices. Every shadow felt like one of them standing just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. The next day, the sun felt wrong, too bright, too harsh. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The world outside seemed distant, muted, as if I were trapped in a fog. I went about my day mechanically, unable to focus on anything. Every creak of the house, every distant thud, set my heart racing. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that the children were just a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something wrong with them. And something even more wrong with me. The night came again, and with it, the strange sensation of being watched. As darkness fell, the familiar chill crept through the house. I could feel the weight of it pressing against the windows, seeping under the door. The silence was unbearable. I couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't let them appear, not without answers. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening. The clock ticked past midnight before I finally made up my mind. I had to go out there again. I couldn't let this torment continue without confronting it. I stepped outside cautiously, the cold air biting at my skin. The yard was just as I remembered, quiet, still. The moonlight cast eerie shadows on the ground, and the trees swayed gently in the wind. But this time, there was no sound. No distant laughter. No playful whispers. The children were not here, at least not yet. I waited, my breath coming in short, anxious bursts. Time seemed to stretch on, each second dragging out as I stood there in the dark. I thought about turning back, about giving up, but something told me that I couldn't. I had to know. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flicker of movement near the trees. At first, it was barely noticeable, like a shadow shifting. But then it grew more distinct. One child. Then another. And another. The same 4 figures. Standing still. Watching. Silent. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But instead, I found myself moving toward them, my body taking steps without my consent. My feet moved over the gravel, slow and heavy. Every step felt like I was walking through molasses. And yet, I couldn't stop. While I was a few feet away, they didn't move. Not a single one of them. Their faces remained expressionless, their eyes fixed on me, their tiny bodies swaying gently in the breeze. I stopped. There was no sound, not even the soft rustling of leaves. The world felt impossibly still, as though it were holding its breath. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. I cleared it, forcing the words out. "What do you want from me?" No response. A chill ran through me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My pulse quickened. The silence was suffocating. And then, just as I was about to turn and leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of them, who I thought had been motionless this whole time, took a slow step forward. It wasn't quick or sudden, but it was deliberate. It moved closer, its small feet barely making a sound on the ground. I stood frozen, unable to move. The child stopped just within arm's reach, its face still hidden in shadow, its eyes locked on mine. Then it spoke. The voice was not a child's voice. It was hollow, distant, as though it came from far away, from somewhere unreachable. "Play with us, forever." The words echoed in my mind, their weight sinking into my chest like a stone. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My limbs were frozen, locked in place by a fear so deep that it paralyzed me. The other children began to step forward, one by one, each of them taking their turn, each of them saying the same words in that same hollow voice. "Play with us, forever." I couldn't make sense of it. My mind was racing, spinning with questions, but no answers. What did they mean? What did they want from me? I wanted to run. I wanted to escape. But my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the children. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they stepped back, retreating into the darkness, one by one. Their eyes never leaving mine, their bodies slowly fading into the shadows. I stood there, motionless, staring into the empty yard, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. They were gone, but the words lingered in my mind, repeating over and over again. "Play with us, forever." I don't know what they are. I don't know what they want. But I can't stop thinking about them, and I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, waiting for me. And maybe, just maybe, I'm starting to think that I won't be able to escape them. The days blurred together after that night. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, those pale, blank stares. Their hollow voices echoed in my head, repeating their words over and over. "Play with us, forever." It was as if my mind had become a prison, and the only thing keeping me captive was that sound. I tried to ignore it. I tried to go back to my normal life, but it wasn't possible. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, what I had seen. The children had been so real, so solid, and yet they had vanished into the night like shadows in the wind. It didn't make sense. I spent my days staring out of windows, waiting for the night to come again. I knew, deep down, that I couldn't run from this. I couldn't pretend it wasn't real. Every inch of me screamed to forget about them, to go on with my life, but I couldn't. Nightfall came once more, and this time I couldn't ignore it any longer. The pull to return to that yard was too strong. It was like a magnetic force drawing me in. So, without thinking, I went. The yard was quiet. Too quiet. There were no sounds of rustling leaves, no distant barking of dogs. It was as if the world had held its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the door handle. My feet dragged, hesitant but inexorably moving forward. I knew what I would find. I knew they were waiting. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me immediately. The chill of the night air wrapped itself around me like a shroud. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders, but it didn't help. The cold was deeper, more pervasive than anything the night air could provide. I waited. The darkness seemed endless, stretching out before me like a void. The yard felt foreign now, like a place I no longer belonged. And then I saw them. The same 4 figures stood at the far edge of the yard, perfectly still. They were almost indistinguishable from the shadows, blending into the night in a way that made my breath catch in my throat. But I knew them. I knew they were the same. Their faces were unreadable, their eyes hollow, just like before. They didn't speak. They didn't move. But I knew they were watching me. I could feel it. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything, if it had all been some sick dream. But the cold, hard truth settled in like a weight on my chest. This was real. They were real. I stepped closer, unable to stop myself. I had to know. I had to understand. My feet carried me forward, one step at a time, each movement slow and deliberate, but my heart raced. While I was a few feet away, one of them, the smallest one, turned its head slightly, its eyes fixing on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, unsure of what to do. My breath caught in my throat as I waited for something, anything, to happen. And then, slowly, the child smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It wasn't innocent. It was a smile that made the air grow heavier, darker. The kind of smile that twisted my stomach into knots. And I realized, then, that there was nothing innocent about them. The others moved, slowly stepping forward, their movements unerringly synchronized. Each of them, one after the other, shifted toward me, their eyes never leaving mine. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't form words. It was as if my very soul was paralyzed, held hostage by the intensity of their gaze. The smallest one, still smiling, reached out a hand. It wasn't a child's hand. It was too pale, too thin, its fingers stretching unnaturally long. I watched, transfixed, as it drew closer, its hand shaking, but not from fear. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The air grew thick with a sense of dread, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something horrible to happen. The voice came again. This time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was louder, clearer, more insistent. Play with us, forever. The words were like a curse, wrapping around me like chains, pulling me into their orbit, into their dark, endless game. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I was frozen. Helpless. The smallest one's fingers brushed my arm, and it felt like ice, cold, penetrating. The touch lingered longer than I expected, and a shock of panic surged through me. I snapped my head back, trying to break free of the trance, but it was as if I were stuck in place, my body no longer obeying me. And then I heard it. The soft sound of their footsteps, but not just one set. All of them moving in sync, surrounding me, closing in from all sides. I couldn't see them anymore. Just the darkness, the blackness pressing in, swallowing everything whole. I had no escape. There was no way out. I was going to play with them. Forever. And I didn't know how to stop it. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the twisted, horrible smile of the smallest child, its eyes gleaming with a terrible, endless hunger. I don't know how long I was out. When I woke up, everything was wrong. The air was still and thick with the smell of earth, damp and musty, as if I had been lying in the dirt for hours. My mouth tasted like metal, and my hands felt cold, almost unnatural. They were shaking. I sat up, my head spinning. The world around me was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the moon filtering through a dense canopy of trees. The ground beneath me was soft, mossy. Where was I? This wasn't my yard. This wasn't my home. Panic surged through me as I stood up, stumbling to my feet. I could barely make sense of the place. The trees, tall and twisted, loomed over me, casting long shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. The air was heavy, oppressive. Every breath I took felt thick, suffocating. And then I heard them. The softest sound, at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But it wasn't wind. It was too rhythmic. Too deliberate. I turned, slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. They were there. The children. But they weren't the same as before. They were different. More distant, more ethereal. Their faces, pale and expressionless, glowed faintly in the darkness. Their eyes, still hollow, reflected the moonlight with an unnatural sheen. They didn't speak this time. They didn't need to. Their presence, their stare, was enough. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. The children circled around me, their movements slow and deliberate, like they were savoring every moment. Every step they took was like a ripple in the air, a small disturbance in the perfect stillness of the place. One of them, the one I had seen before, the smallest one, stepped closer. Its face was almost human, but not quite. Its skin was stretched too tight, its eyes too large, its mouth too wide. The smile that had haunted me for days stretched even wider, showing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. "Play with us, forever," it whispered, its voice like a cold breeze, like the scraping of nails on glass. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, as if I had been screaming for hours. The air around me felt thick with something ancient. Something that had been waiting. Watching. I looked around, desperate to find a way out. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their gnarled branches twisting into the sky like the fingers of some long-forgotten monster. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, to pulse, as if it were alive, breathing in time with my own panicked heartbeat. The children drew closer. They were too close now. I could feel the chill of their presence, the coldness that radiated from them like a wave. They were circling me, closing in, and I couldn't escape. One by one, their faces became clearer. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, bored into mine, and I felt something stirring deep inside me, a terrible recognition, an overwhelming sense of fear. It was as if they knew something I didn't. Something I couldn't understand. They had been waiting for me. I wasn't supposed to be here. This place wasn't meant for me. This wasn't just a yard, or a forest, or a dream. This was their world. Their domain. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something in the dark. I fell hard, the ground rough and unforgiving. When I looked up, the children were no longer standing. They were crouched, their eyes locked on me, their forms bending in unnatural ways, twisting and contorting as though they were trying to crawl out of the very fabric of reality. The smallest one reached out a hand, its fingers too long, too thin. It touched my cheek, and the coldness that radiated from its skin burned through me like ice. "Play with us, forever," it repeated, its voice more insistent now, almost pleading. The others joined in, their voices melding together in a haunting chorus, the words stretching out into the night, echoing in my head, filling my thoughts, drowning me in their need. "Play with us, forever. Play with us, forever." I tried to pull away, to fight back, but it was no use. My body refused to move, my mind screaming for freedom, but my limbs were frozen, stiff, locked in place by something far stronger than fear. I realized then, it wasn't just a game. They didn't want me to play with them. They wanted me to stay, to be with them, forever. My thoughts began to fragment, slipping away like sand through my fingers. My heart raced, my chest tight, as I struggled to keep hold of myself, of my mind. But it was slipping. It was all slipping away. The smallest one leaned in closer, its face now mere inches from mine. I could see the hollow emptiness in its eyes, the cold void that seemed to swallow everything around it. And then it spoke, one final time, in a voice that was all too familiar. "Play with us, forever." And everything went dark. I have to ask you, have you ever heard music when there's no apparent source? That's how it started. A simple melody, faint at first, echoing through the walls of my apartment late at night. It's always the same song. I can't tell you what it is, it's not familiar, but it feels strangely nostalgic, as if it's something I've heard in a dream. It all began 2 weeks ago. It was an ordinary evening, no different than any other. I had just settled into my couch, the usual end-of-day fatigue weighing on me. My apartment is small but cozy. The kind of space where you'd expect silence to feel comforting, familiar. But that night, it was broken. The first note floated into my consciousness as I stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. It was soft, distant. I paused. Where is that coming from? I thought. The silence that had once been comforting now felt unnerving, as if something was lurking beneath the surface, waiting. I turned around to scan the room. I have no musical instruments, nothing that could make that sound. My phone was on the table, but it wasn't playing anything. The TV was off. Even the clock was silent. And yet, the melody continued. I stood there, motionless, trying to locate it. It was coming from somewhere in the apartment. But where? I walked from room to room, searching, my footsteps muted against the carpet. The sound seemed to move with me, following me, always just a few steps ahead. I thought maybe the neighbors had left their music on, bleeding through the thin walls, but no, this wasn't something that could come from a neighboring apartment. It was too clear, too personal. It felt like it was inside my own head. I tried to ignore it, but the music was relentless. It didn't stop. Each note played over and over, looping in my mind even after I tried to sleep. It was the same eerie tune that filled the dark corners of my mind. That night, sleep came only in short bursts, with the music still drifting in and out of my consciousness like a phantom. Over the next few days, the melody began to change. It would come at random times, not every night, but often enough to make me question my sanity. I'd be washing the dishes, and then there it was. The melody, hauntingly familiar yet always distant. Sometimes it would come from behind me, other times from the kitchen, even though I was alone. I started to think I was going crazy. I was tired. Work was stressing me out. But deep down, I knew this was something different. Then, last night, it got worse. I woke up to the music playing. Not faint this time. No, it was loud. And it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the room, around me, all around me. I was frozen in place, my sheets tangled around me, my heart pounding. The melody sounded wrong. It twisted like a broken record. Each note sounded sharp, grating against the silence. My eyes darted around the room, wide with terror, but there was nothing to see. No source. I grabbed my phone, checking the time, 3 a.m. I had to find where the sound was coming from. I stood up, my legs shaky, my breath ragged. The music had intensified, filling the room like it was alive, its presence oppressive. I moved toward the kitchen, knowing something was terribly wrong. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic thumping. Not the usual haunting melody. This was something different. A pulse. A heartbeat. The moment I turned the corner into the living room, the thumping stopped. But the music was still there. Still filling every inch of the apartment, pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel it in my chest, in my bones, as if the sound was vibrating through my very skin. I started to panic. It was coming closer. It was coming closer. I ran to the door, desperate to escape, but I couldn't open it. The doorknob wouldn't budge, as if something invisible had a hold of it, trapping me inside. I turned back around, my mind racing, my body trembling. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop it. And then, for the first time, I saw it. A shadow. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of my vision, but when I turned my head, it was there. A figure, tall and indistinct, standing in the doorway to my bedroom. It was like it was made of the same darkness as the room, but it was there. It was real. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my mind spinning in panic, the music drawing out all coherent thought. It took a step toward me, its form shifting, changing, as if it couldn't decide what shape it wanted to take. But it was there. I could hear it breathing now, faintly, through the music. And then it spoke. A voice, distorted by the music, warped and hollow. "Why are you running, James?" I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and the room began to spin. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. "I'll show you where it comes from." The figure took another step forward. The music swelled, louder, overwhelming me. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I pushed against the door again, the force of my panic finally breaking the invisible hold, and I fled into the hallway. But even as I ran, the music didn't stop. It followed me. It had always been following me. I couldn't escape. I don't know how long I've been here, locked in this place. The music never stops. It's with me all the time now. It's always there, just out of sight, waiting. I'm losing myself. I don't know where the music ends or where I begin. I'm terrified that if I listen long enough, I might just hear the answer. I thought I had escaped, but the music followed me. It never stopped, not even for a moment. It had woven itself into the very fabric of my existence, as if it were part of the air I breathed. I tried to block it out, earphones, loud noises, distraction, but nothing worked. It was always there, a constant presence in the background of my mind, louder at night, but present during the day as well. It had only been a few days since that night when I saw the figure in the doorway, and I still couldn't make sense of what happened. Every time I thought I was beginning to understand it, the music would shift, change, and twist into something new. The haunting melody, once soft and unfamiliar, had taken on rhythm, a pulse, almost as if it were alive. It was no longer just background noise. It was a presence, a living entity that seemed to be feeding off my fear. I didn't tell anyone. Who could I tell? How could I explain what was happening to me? The music wasn't real. It wasn't coming from any of my devices. It was something else, something unexplainable, and if I spoke about it, I knew people would think I was losing my mind. The nights were the worst. It always started just before I was about to fall asleep. That familiar hum would seep into the room, subtle at first, but then growing louder, more insistent. I could almost hear it now, even as I sat here, in the sterile daylight. It was creeping back in. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I laid in my bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The sound was louder now, like it was inside my own head, echoing in the space between my thoughts. I closed my eyes, but all I saw was the shadow, the thing, in the doorway, its form shifting like a cloud of darkness. And its voice. "Why are you running, James?" I jolted upright in bed, my chest heaving with panic. The silence in the room was suffocating, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just a nightmare, just my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew it wasn't. I could still hear the music, even now. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, lingering on the edge of my perception. My heart started to race again. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, hoping that fresh air would clear my head, hoping that maybe the music would fade if I was far enough away from my apartment. But as I stepped into the hall, the music seemed to follow me. No matter how far I walked, it stayed with me, creeping into my consciousness like a parasite. The streets outside were cold and empty, just the occasional car passing by. But the music, the melody that had started as nothing more than a vague sound in the background of my mind, was now a constant companion. It was growing stronger again, swirling in my ears, almost loud enough to drown out the street noise. I couldn't escape it. I turned a corner, desperate for some relief, and that's when I saw him. A man was standing at the end of the street, silhouetted against the dim streetlight. He was motionless, staring straight at me. There was something wrong about him. His posture was unnatural, rigid. I couldn't tell what it was, but something about him sent a chill down my spine. The music shifted then, just like that. It stopped being a melody and started to form into something else. A rhythmic beat. A thump, 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 like a heartbeat, matching the pace of my own. It was too much. I couldn't breathe. I started walking faster, hoping the man would disappear, but he didn't. He just stood there, watching. The music, it was coming from him. I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through the air. It was his heartbeat. the rhythm pulsing through the street, through my very chest. I didn't stop. I ran. I don't know how long I was running for, but when I finally turned a corner, I was back in my apartment complex, panting, my legs aching. The music had quieted, but it was still there, lurking in the background, inescapable. And the man, he was gone, as if he had never been there at all. I collapsed against the door to my apartment, my heart racing. Sweat dripped down my forehead as I fumbled with the keys. When I finally managed to get inside, I locked the door behind me, breathing heavily. I had to face the truth. This wasn't just about a song. This wasn't some weird, irrational fear. This was real. And it was following me, tracking me, and I had no idea why. I tried to calm myself, to rationalize the events. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was exhausted. But deep down, I knew something had changed. The music had found me. And now, it wasn't going to let me go. I slumped onto the couch, pulling the blanket over me in an attempt to shut out the world. The music still played in my mind, louder now, louder than ever. I could hear it even without the external noise. It was in my thoughts, weaving itself into my very being. And I couldn't stop it. I needed answers. But I knew the truth now. There was no escaping it. The music, it was in control. The next day felt like a blur. I tried to go about my routine, to do the things I always did, but the music followed me. It wasn't just at night anymore, it was with me in the mornings, creeping into my thoughts as I made my coffee, hanging in the air like a heavy mist, impossible to ignore. Even at work, it lingered in the background, like a faint hum just beneath the surface of my concentration. I couldn't focus. Every time I tried to concentrate on something, emails, reports, simple tasks, the music would drown everything out. The melody twisted itself into something dark, something that had a rhythm now, like a pulse that mirrored my own. It became harder and harder to separate it from my own thoughts. At lunch, I left the office, desperate to get some air, to escape the suffocating melody that seemed to cling to me. I walked aimlessly through the park, the chill of the wind doing little to calm the anxiety that was building inside me. Each step I took seemed to amplify the music in my mind. It was getting louder, and somehow more urgent. I felt eyes on me. I looked around. No one was there. But there was an undeniable feeling, a presence at my back, watching me. I quickened my pace, but it didn't help. The sensation only grew stronger. Like someone, or something, was right behind me, breathing down my neck. I turned a corner, looking over my shoulder, and I saw him again. The man from last night. He was standing near the edge of the park, barely visible in the shadows. His posture was just as rigid, his face obscured by the darkness, but I could feel his gaze on me. The air seemed to grow colder around him, the music shifting to a deep, thudding beat that echoed in my chest. It was no longer just in my mind, it was filling the space around me, vibrating through my bones. I froze. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the ground, my body heavy with fear. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching. And then, I heard it. A faint whisper, carried by the wind, just behind me. "You're listening, aren't you?" I spun around, but there was no one there. The music crescendoed in my mind, louder, more insistent, like it was trying to drown out every other thought. My pulse quickened, my breathing shallow. The whispering continued, not from behind me, but from all around me, filling the space. It was like the music itself was speaking to me now. "Why are you afraid?" I stumbled backward, my legs weak. The world felt like it was closing in on me. The sounds, the music, they weren't just sounds anymore. They were alive. A force that was pressing in on me, making the air thick with dread. I could barely breathe. I needed to leave. I needed to escape. I turned and ran, pushing past the trees, the benches, the paths, until I found myself back at the entrance to the park. My heart was pounding in my ears, my vision blurred by panic. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I just kept running. When I reached my apartment, I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the lock. I wanted to scream, to break something, but I couldn't. The music was louder now, more frantic. It was everywhere. Inside me, around me. It was like a wave crashing over me, a constant reminder that it was in control. I collapsed onto the floor, my back against the door, my hands pressed over my ears. I tried to block it out, to shut it down, but it was impossible. It was in my head, in my soul, clawing its way through every thought, every moment. "Why are you running, James?" The voice, his voice, came from the corner of the room, a whisper just beyond my reach. I froze, my body locking in place. The music was louder now, so loud I could feel it vibrating through the walls. The man's figure appeared in the corner of the room, just out of the corner of my eye, a shadow standing still in the darkness. I couldn't see him clearly, but I could feel him. It was like he was inside the music. Part of it. The two of them, him and the sound, were one and the same, and I couldn't escape. I didn't know what to do. How could I fight something that was everywhere? Something that was in my head, in my world? How could I resist something that made no sense? I tried to speak, but no words came out. The music swallowed them. "You can't hide from it," the voice whispered again, this time louder, more forceful. I looked up, heart hammering in my chest, and for the briefest moment, I saw his face. His eyes. Black, hollow, empty, like there was nothing left inside him. His lips didn't move, but I heard his voice again. "It was always inside you, James. It was always waiting." A cold chill swept through the room, the music now at a fever pitch, and for the first time, I felt it. The overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. That whatever was in the room with me was more than just a figure in the shadows. It was something else. Something ancient. And then, everything went silent. I blinked. The music, the whispers, the presence, all gone. I sat there in the silence, my hands trembling, my breath coming in short gasps. Had I imagined it all? Had I finally lost my mind? But deep down, I knew. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. The music wasn't gone. It was waiting for me. And soon it would return. The silence in the apartment felt almost unnatural, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I sat motionless, my back pressed against the door, my hands still shaking. I couldn't tell if the music had stopped or if I had just gotten so used to it that my mind was blocking it out. But the stillness was wrong. It was an oppressive kind of silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your heart race. I tried to breathe deeply, to calm my frantic pulse, but it was impossible. My mind was a mess of thoughts, too many thoughts, each one leading to another. Was this really happening? Had I lost my grip on reality? The rational part of me screamed that there was an explanation, some logical reason for the strange music. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. This wasn't a random malfunction or a glitch in the system. This was something more. Something I couldn't explain. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling weak, as if they weren't entirely mine to control. The room around me felt unfamiliar now, warped somehow. It looked like my apartment, but it also didn't. The shadows seemed darker, the light dimmer. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. It was as if the space itself was pressing in on me, reacting to the presence that had been here, whatever it was. I forced myself to move. I had to find out where the music was coming from, even though I was terrified of what I might discover. The thought of it, of confronting whatever this was, filled me with a sickening dread. But I had no choice. I had to know. I walked cautiously through the apartment, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The living room was eerily quiet now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. Something was watching. I approached the stereo system, still unplugged, still completely off. I checked the speakers. Nothing. The apartment was still as I had left it, but something had changed. It felt wrong. I moved down the hall, my feet barely making a sound as I crept toward my bedroom. Each step felt like it took me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The air was heavier here, colder, as if the very walls had absorbed the terror of what had been happening. The music wasn't here, not physically, but I could feel it. It was just beneath the surface, like an invisible pressure building in the air. When I reached my bedroom door, I hesitated. Something was off. It was like the room was holding its breath, just as I had been. I reached for the doorknob, but before I could touch it, the sound returned. It wasn't loud at first, but it was there, a soft melody, familiar but twisted, like a lullaby being played backward. It crawled into my mind, cold and insistent, wrapping around my thoughts, squeezing. I jerked the door open. The music grew louder, more frantic. The room was exactly as I had left it, but I felt the presence again. The man. I couldn't see him, but I knew he was there. Somewhere in the room, lurking, watching. Are you ready to listen? His voice came from nowhere, right beside my ear, though no one was there. I spun around, my heart pounding, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The room felt smaller, the shadows deeper. The music was everywhere now, filling the space, crawling up the walls, seeping into the corners. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It had become something tangible, something alive. You're not alone anymore, James, the voice whispered again, its tone dark, almost affectionate, like a lover's caress. You never were. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to leave. The pressure, the sound, the voice, everything was closing in on me. I turned to flee, but before I could reach the door, something caught my eye. A shadow, a figure, standing at the far side of the room. For a moment, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it moved. The shadow stepped forward, slow and deliberate, its form shifting as it emerged from the darkness. It wasn't human. The figure was tall and thin, its body too elongated, its limbs too long, like something that didn't belong in this world. Its face was obscured, a blur of shadows, but its eyes were black, hollow, empty. There was no emotion, no expression. Just an endless, unfeeling void. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The music grew louder, the melody twisting, distorting into something grotesque, something unbearable. "You'll understand soon," the voice said, now coming from the figure itself, the sound vibrating through my skull, filling every crevice of my mind. "You'll listen. You'll be part of it." I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot. It was like the music had taken hold of me, and now I was caught in its web, unable to escape. The figure took another step toward me, its long, spindly fingers reaching out, and I felt the air shift, like something was about to snap. The door to my apartment slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The pressure in the room was unbearable. I felt like I was suffocating, like the walls were closing in, the music pushing in from all sides. My head spun, my thoughts were a jumble of confusion and fear. "It's not over, James," the voice echoed, its sound vibrating through my chest. "It's just begun." I closed my eyes, and for a moment, the world fell silent again. When I opened them, the figure was gone. The music was gone. Everything was still. But I knew, deep in my bones, that it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. I don't know how long I stood there, in the silence, waiting for something, anything, to happen. My mind was racing, every thought colliding with another, but none of them made sense. The music was gone, the figure was gone, but the fear, oh, the fear, lingered, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake off. I reached out for the door handle, my hand trembling. My fingers brushed the cold metal, and I hesitated. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things anymore. Was this still my apartment? Was the music truly gone, or had it only retreated for a moment? What was real? What was happening to me? With a deep breath, I yanked the door open, stepping out into the hallway. It was as if the entire building was holding its breath with me. The air was thick, heavy. The dim light flickered overhead. I moved cautiously, each step echoing in the stillness, but my footsteps felt muffled, like they were being swallowed by the oppressive silence. The building seemed different now, warped in a way that only added to the growing tension in my chest. The hallways stretched on longer than they should have. The walls seemed to shift, closing in, then opening up, as if they were alive and breathing. I could feel the music beneath everything, lurking just out of reach, faint, distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from anywhere. It wasn't coming from anything. It was just there, pressing into my mind, filling every gap. I stumbled toward the staircase, the only way out. My breath was shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could feel the air getting thicker, almost sticky, as if the world itself was stretching, distorting around me. The shadows in the corners of my vision flickered, like something, or someone, was just beyond my sight. "It's not over," the voice whispered again, the words crawling up my spine. I couldn't tell if it was coming from the walls, the music, or from somewhere deep inside me. My mind was unraveling, and I could feel myself slipping into something dark. I forced myself down the stairs, one step at a time. My legs were shaking, and my breath came faster. Each stair creaked beneath my weight, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. The melody, that damned melody, was getting louder again, but it wasn't coming from anywhere. It was in the walls. It was in the air. It was inside me. I pushed through the front door of the building and into the street. The cold night air hit my face, sharp and biting, but it didn't feel real. Nothing felt real anymore. I stood there, in the dark, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, waiting for something, someone, to reveal itself. But there was nothing. No figure. No music. Just the empty street, the street lamp casting its sickly light. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I was frozen. There was no escape. The street stretched out before me, deserted. Every direction was the same, empty, silent. The buildings loomed on either side, their windows dark, their doors shut tight. I could hear the music again, louder now, surrounding me. It was everywhere. It was in my head, in my ears, in my chest. And then it stopped. Suddenly, as if it had never been there. The air was still. The music was gone. The voice was silent. For the first time since all this had started, there was nothing but the eerie silence. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe it was over. Maybe I had finally escaped whatever this was. But then I heard it again. A soft sound, a faint melody, barely audible in the air. But it was different now. It wasn't just the music. It was a whispering, too quiet, indistinct, but unmistakable. The voice. You can't run from it, James. You can't escape it. I whipped around, searching the street, but there was nothing. No one. The voice had come from the shadows, from the dark spaces between the buildings. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. It was there, just out of reach, watching, waiting. I stumbled back toward the building, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel the walls closing in on me again, the music crawling into my mind, twisting my thoughts. There was no escape. It was everywhere. I reached the door, but it wouldn't open. My hand fumbled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, but the door stayed locked, as if it had sealed itself from the inside. My panic grew. I was trapped. The sound of the music rose again, louder now, more insistent, like it was reaching into me, pulling at my very soul. And then I heard footsteps. Light, barely audible, but unmistakable. Slow, deliberate steps approaching me from behind. I turned, but there was no one there. Only darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could feel the air change, feel the weight of the presence behind me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was frozen in place, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the presence was gone. The footsteps, the voice, the music, it all disappeared into nothing. I was alone again. But I knew, deep in my bones, that I wasn't. I never would be again. The music, the voice, it was inside me now. I could hear it. Feel it. It was waiting. And I had no idea how to stop it. I don't know why I decided to check my phone that night. Maybe it was the silence of the apartment, or maybe it was just the emptiness that always seemed to settle around me when I was alone. It had been a long day, and I was just about to fall asleep when I picked up my phone. But when I opened the gallery, something was wrong. There was a photo on my phone. A photo I hadn't taken. It was of me, lying in my bed, asleep. At first, I thought it was a prank. Maybe someone had accessed my phone, or I'd accidentally taken the picture myself. But there was no way. I'd been awake, scrolling through social media not long before. My phone hadn't even been near my bed. I zoomed in on the picture, trying to make sense of it. The lighting was dim, the shadows deep in the corners of the room. Everything looked normal, too normal. But as I scanned the background, my heart stopped. In the distance, barely visible, there was a shape. It was blurred, distorted, as though someone had moved too quickly. But the most terrifying part was the way it was standing. Still. Watching. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Had someone broken into my apartment while I slept? Was it possible to take a photo without waking me? But I didn't know anyone who could do that. And the shape, it was different. The way it was positioned, the way it seemed to blur into the background, it didn't make sense. I flipped through the other pictures, hoping to find something that would explain it. Maybe a mistake. Maybe a glitch. But every single photo was normal, taken by me, in the places I had been. Nothing like this. Nothing like this haunting, blurry figure that lingered in the shadows of my own room. My hand was shaking as I stared at the screen, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But no matter how hard I thought, no matter how many excuses I tried to make, I couldn't explain it. I got out of bed and walked toward the kitchen, hoping the movement would shake off the unease. My mind kept returning to the photo, the figure, the sensation that I wasn't alone. But I tried to push it out of my thoughts. It was just a photo, just a trick of the light, maybe. I tried to focus on something else, anything else, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. There was something wrong. Something watching. I glanced at the clock. It was late, maybe around 2 in the morning. The apartment felt colder, the air thicker, as if it were pressing in on me. My phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up as if to remind me of its presence. Hesitant, I picked it up. This time, the message wasn't from a friend or social media. It was a notification from my camera roll. Another photo. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it. It was another photo of me, sleeping in my bed. This time, however, the figure was clearer. More defined. It was closer. I could see the outline of a face, distorted, like it was made of shadow, but there was no mistaking it. A face. Watching me. I felt my blood run cold as I looked at it. I hadn't heard anything. No footsteps. No creaks in the floor. Nothing. The air in the room felt heavier, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced through possibilities. Was I losing my mind? Had I forgotten taking these photos? Was someone in my apartment watching me while I slept? But how? The windows were locked, the doors secured. There was no way someone could have been in here without me hearing something. And yet, this photo, this eerie figure, how did it get there? I stood frozen, my eyes glued to the screen. The silence in the room pressed down on me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then, just as I was about to put the phone down, another notification. Another photo. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I opened it, and there it was. But this time, the figure was no longer in the background. It was right in front of me. Right at the edge of my bed. Its face, still blurred, its form dark and shifting. It was closer. Closer than it had ever been. I felt a wave of panic rise up in me. The room suddenly felt much smaller, as though the walls were closing in around me. I looked around in desperation, but everything seemed normal, too normal. The apartment, the bed, the stillness, nothing had changed, but everything felt wrong. My phone buzzed again. Another notification. This time, I couldn't look. I was too afraid. I didn't want to see what was next. But I knew I had to. With trembling hands, I tapped the notification. And then, nothing. No photo. Just a blank screen. The silence. I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was too quiet. Too still. I looked around again, more frantic this time. But there was nothing. Nothing but the shadows. And then, a sound. A faint sound. Barely perceptible at first, like a soft rustling coming from behind me. I froze. And then, I heard it clearly. A breath. Not my own. A breath. I whipped around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. No one. Just the empty room. The shadows creeping into the corners. But then I realized the photo had been right. The figure had been there. Watching. And now, it was closer than ever. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stood frozen, the fear clutching at my chest. I turned back to the phone, still in my trembling hand, but there was no new notification. No more photos. It felt like the world had paused, frozen in time, and every noise around me felt magnified, distorted. The silence now felt oppressive, like the air itself was thick with something unseen, waiting. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out of the apartment, run into the street where people could see me, where I could feel safe again. But my legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the spot. I glanced nervously toward the door. The apartment seemed smaller, suffocating. The shadows stretched longer than they should have, crawling like fingers reaching toward me. My eyes darted to the corners of the room, expecting to see something, or someone standing just out of view, waiting. But there was nothing. Just the emptiness. I looked back at the phone, my eyes scanning the screen as though it held some explanation, some reason for this terror. The photos, the figure, how could they have appeared there without me knowing? How had I missed someone entering my room, capturing images while I slept? I flicked through the gallery again, searching for any hint that I was simply imagining things. But the more I looked, the more I felt my skin crawl. There were no other photos like the first two. Just the ones I had taken myself, in places I had been during the day, nothing unusual, nothing out of place. But then, there it was. The next photo, tucked in between some older ones. I hadn't seen it before, hadn't taken it. It was another one of me, lying in my bed. But this time, the figure wasn't blurry or distorted. It was in full view. Clear. I stared at it, my hands shaking, my throat dry. The figure was no longer in the background. It stood at the foot of the bed, close enough that I could see the outline of its face, its features sharp, unnaturally still. But what truly made my blood run cold was the expression. It wasn't angry or sad. It was just empty. The eyes, though, those eyes, they pierced through the screen as if they were looking straight at me, right through me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone, but the screen remained in my hands, pulling my gaze back in like a magnet. I couldn't look away, even though every part of me screamed to do so. The figure's face, it wasn't a face anymore. It was just a mass of shadows, pulsating, as though it was made from the darkness itself. But the eyes remained, unblinking, watching, always watching. I felt a wave of nausea hit me, my stomach twisting as I realized with sickening clarity, this thing, This figure, it wasn't just watching me through the lens of my phone. It had been in my room, and it had been there for far longer than I had realized. I swallowed hard, fighting the overwhelming urge to panic. My heart thudded in my chest, loud enough that it felt as though it might break through my ribs. Every part of me wanted to scream, to run, but I knew I couldn't. Not yet. I had to understand. I had to know what was happening, or I would go insane. I slowly moved toward the window, keeping my eyes trained on the shadows, on the phone. The wind was gentle, but it still made the curtain stir slightly. I pushed the window open just enough to let in the cool night air. The familiar streetlights outside offered a faint sense of comfort, but they felt distant, like they were part of another world. As I stood there, trying to calm my racing mind, I noticed something strange. There, just beyond the curtain, was the faintest movement. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw it again. A figure. It was standing in the street below, half shrouded in the shadows of the trees. My heart skipped a beat as I squinted, trying to make out the details. But the figure didn't move. It was still, watching. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. The street was quiet, no cars, no sounds of footsteps. Yet, that figure stood there, perfectly still. My breath caught in my throat. The photo. The figure from my bed. Was it outside, watching me through the window now? Or was it something far worse, something that had been with me all along, in the shadows, in the quiet moments when I was unaware? I slammed the window shut, the noise startling in the stillness of the apartment. I backed away from it quickly, my eyes still fixed on the shadow outside. But the figure didn't move. It stayed there, locked in place, like it was waiting. I needed help. I couldn't stay here. But who would believe me? Who would understand? I grabbed my phone again, desperate to reach someone, anyone. But as I scrolled through my contacts, the screen flickered. The text messages I had received moments before, gone. Every single one, wiped from my phone. I felt my stomach churn again. My fingers, stiff with fear, shook as I scrolled further down the contact list, but the names were disappearing one by one, replaced with the same empty blank space. Then the phone buzzed again. It was a notification. Another photo. The phone buzzed again, a low vibration that seemed to echo through the stillness of the room. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the screen, frozen. The dread was overwhelming, yet I couldn't bring myself to look away. A new photo had arrived. I didn't want to open it. I couldn't bring myself to face whatever horror it held, but I knew, deep down, that I had no choice. My fingers hovered above the screen, shaking uncontrollably. With a deep breath, I tapped the notification. The photo loaded slowly, but I could already feel my pulse quicken. There, on the screen, was the image I feared most. It was a photo of my apartment. My room. The very space where I stood only moments ago. But something was off, wrong. The perspective was different. The photo was taken from the farthest corner of the room, near the door. And there, standing in the center of the frame, was me, still awake, still looking down at my phone. But there was something else. Something new. A figure was standing in the doorway, just beyond my view. Its shape was unclear, but its presence was undeniable. It stood tall, dark, a silhouette against the dim light from the hallway. The shadows around it seemed to warp and stretch unnaturally, like the figure was somehow distorting reality itself. I felt my blood run cold. This wasn't just a photo, it was a direct threat, a reminder that the figure was close, closer than I could have imagined. I tried to breathe, to calm myself, but the room felt smaller, the air thicker. The walls seemed to close in as the weight of the realization sank in. I wasn't alone. Not now. Not ever. I flicked through the other photos in a frantic attempt to understand what was happening, but each one was more disturbing than the last. Some showed me in my apartment, asleep, the figure lurking in the background. Others were taken from places I didn't remember going, each with the same eerie presence. I scrolled until my phone froze. The screen flickered, then went black. I cursed under my breath, tapping the power button, but the phone wouldn't turn on. The battery wasn't dead. I knew it wasn't. It had been fully charged when I began this nightmare. A sound came from behind me, soft at first, like a breath, then louder, sharper, more distinct. It was the sound of something, or someone, moving through the apartment. I spun around, heart racing, eyes darting across the dark room. But there was nothing. No one. The only movement came from the shadows, which twisted unnaturally in the dim light. I had felt it again, a presence, creeping, watching. My skin crawled as I took a hesitant step toward the door. But before I could reach for the handle, another noise echoed from the hallway. A low, guttural sound that sent a shock of terror straight through me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it was the figure. It was out there, in the hallway, closer than ever. My mind raced, my thoughts a whirlwind. I had to leave. I had to get out of the apartment, away from whatever was stalking me. But as I turned to the window, hoping for a quick escape, I saw something that made my heart stop. The figure. It was outside, standing in the same spot on the street, just as I had seen before. But this time, it wasn't motionless. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, toward the building. Its steps were silent, but they felt like thunder in my ears. I rushed to the door, hands shaking, but as I reached for the handle, I heard a soft creak from behind me. Slowly, cautiously, I turned. The figure was standing in the doorway. It wasn't like before, where it was just a silhouette. It had a form now, a shape that was both human and not. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its face, if you could call it that, was a blur of darkness. Its eyes, however, were unmistakable. They were wide, hollow, black pits that seemed to devour the light around them. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. I had no idea how it had gotten so close without making a sound. No idea how long it had been standing there, watching me. But I knew one thing for sure, it wasn't just some figment of my imagination. It was real. It was here. And it wasn't going away. I tried to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My legs refused to move, rooted to the spot by the sheer terror that gripped me. The figure's gaze never wavered. It just stood there, staring. And then it moved. It was a blur, faster than I could comprehend. One moment it was standing in the doorway, and the next it was right in front of me. I felt its cold breath on my skin, the chill that seemed to freeze my very soul. The darkness around it seemed to deepen, swallowing everything in its path. I finally found my voice, a high-pitched scream that echoed through the apartment. I turned and ran, stumbling over the furniture, crashing into the walls as I tried to escape. But I knew, deep down, there was no escaping it. It had found me. It had always been here, watching, waiting. I burst into the hallway, my pulse hammering in my ears, but as I looked down the stairwell, my heart sank. There, at the bottom of the stairs, stood the figure. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside, blocking the only way out. I backed away, desperate for any other escape, but the hallway stretched on endlessly. The walls seemed to close in, pressing in from every side. The figure advanced, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring every moment. I had no idea what it wanted, but I knew one thing for sure: it wasn't going to let me go. The phone buzzed again. Another photo. I felt the blood drain from my face as I reached into my pocket for the phone, unable to tear my eyes from the figure that was steadily moving toward me. Its presence felt oppressive, suffocating. The air was heavy with the scent of something foul, like decay, but it was more than just the smell. It was the feeling that something horrible, something ancient, was watching, waiting. I fumbled for the phone, my hands slick with sweat, the screen now cracked and dull from too many drops. The buzzing had stopped, but the phone lit up again. The notification was there, its message clear: another photo. I felt my stomach twist into knots as I pressed the screen. The photo loaded with excruciating slowness, as though it knew exactly how to stretch my nerves to their breaking point. When it finally appeared, I could barely breathe. It was a photo of my own face. But not the one I had seen moments before on the bed, not the one from my last blurry image. This time, I was wide awake. My eyes were wide with terror, a grimace frozen on my face, like I had been caught mid-scream. But the most chilling detail was not the terror etched into my features. It was the figure, standing behind me in the background. It was closer this time. Much closer. I turned around so fast I nearly collapsed, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty. The darkness was thick, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the pounding of my heart in my ears. I knew it was there, though. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me. I backed away slowly, my feet dragging, not daring to look away from the shadows. I had to escape. There had to be a way out, a way to get away from it. But the walls felt like they were closing in, the apartment narrowing around me until I could barely breathe. The figure in the photo hadn't just been a coincidence. It had followed me. It had been with me all this time, somehow always one step ahead, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment. It wasn't just in the photos. It was in my life now. And I couldn't escape. Another sound, a low scraping, came from behind me. I spun, heart in my throat, eyes wide, searching the darkness. But once again, there was nothing. Except for the whisper. I didn't know if I heard it or if it was in my head. But it was there, low and guttural, like someone breathing too close to my ear. It wasn't words, just a sound, like the rasp of something shifting in the shadows. My hands were shaking, and I felt nauseous, the darkness closing in tighter with every breath. I had to get out. I had to leave before it found me. I sprinted to the door, but just as my hand reached the knob, the phone buzzed again. I almost didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what new horror awaited me on the screen. But my fingers betrayed me, and I unlocked the phone. Another photo. This time, it wasn't a photo of me. It wasn't a photo of anything in the apartment. Instead, the picture showed the hallway I had just run through. It was taken from the doorway of my room, looking down the dark corridor. But the most disturbing thing was the figure. It was standing at the far end of the hallway. Its limbs were stretched unnaturally, like it was folding itself into the frame of the doorway. Its head was cocked at an angle, tilted to one side, like it was studying me, waiting. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, as though the figure was bleeding into the shadows themselves. I looked up from the phone, and that's when I saw it. It was standing in the hallway, right where the photo had shown. I staggered back, my breath coming in quick gasps. My body screamed at me to run, but my feet refused to move. The figure took a slow step forward, its presence becoming even more tangible, like the air itself was warping around it. It didn't make a sound. It didn't need to. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I turned and ran, my legs pumping desperately as I sprinted through the apartment, the figure hot on my heels. I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, like the thing knew I had nowhere to go. The apartment stretched, like it was never ending. Every turn I took, every door I opened, led me right back to the same spot, the same hallway, the same closed door. It wasn't just the walls that were closing in, the very space itself seemed to bend, to fold around me. I could feel it. The figure was everywhere now. It was in the shadows, in the corners, in the very air I breathed. The phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but I had to. The screen was dark at first, and then it illuminated with a new photo. It was a photo of my reflection in the bathroom mirror. But it wasn't my face I saw. There was something standing behind me, its shape distorted by the reflection. Its face, if you could call it that, was pale and featureless, like a mask of flesh stretched tight over something unnatural. Its eyes were just black pits, empty and void of anything human. And it was smiling. I dropped the phone, the screen cracking as it hit the floor, but it didn't matter. I didn't need to see the photos anymore. I could feel it. I could feel its cold fingers on my neck, its breath on my skin. The darkness swallowed me whole. I don't know how long I stood there, the darkness pressing in around me, suffocating me. My mind was a haze of panic, my thoughts scrambled as I tried to grasp onto anything real. But there was nothing, no comfort, no safety. Only the oppressive silence and the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The coldness seeped into my bones, and I tried to take a step forward, but my legs refused to cooperate. It was as though the floor beneath me had turned to quicksand, sucking me deeper into its grip. My breath was shallow, and my heart pounded in my chest as I looked around the apartment, desperate for some kind of escape. But the walls had changed. They no longer looked familiar. The apartment I had once known was now a twisted labyrinth of darkened hallways and closed doors, each one leading to nowhere. I had to leave. I had to get out. But the phone, the photos, kept flashing in my mind. I couldn't escape them. The images burned into my brain, searing themselves into my memory like scars. The figure, the smile, the reflection. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, pulling it open with a creak that echoed too loudly in the silence. The hallway outside was the same, empty, silent, but something felt different. The air was thicker now, like it was charged with something electric, something malevolent. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. I moved quickly, my heart racing with every step, my eyes darting around for any sign of movement. The faintest flicker of light from the kitchen caught my attention. I turned, instinctively moving toward it. The kitchen light was dim, the shadows in the corners shifting like they had a life of their own. But there was something else, too. Something alive. The fridge door was ajar, and I swore I heard a soft scraping sound coming from inside. A low, dragging noise, like nails against metal. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath hitched, and I slowly turned my head to look down the hallway behind me. The shadows in the hallway were deeper now, almost liquid, swirling and twisting as though they were alive. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Something was there. Watching. Waiting. I backed away from the kitchen, but the scraping sound grew louder. It was unmistakable now, a slow, deliberate drag, like something or someone was moving inside the fridge. The door swung open wider, the darkness inside it seeming to expand. Then I saw it. A face. A pale, featureless face, staring back at me from the fridge, its eyes black holes that seemed to swallow all light. It wasn't human. There was no shape to the face, no features, just smooth, blank skin stretched tight over a skull. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat, but the figure was already moving. Slowly, it began to rise, its body folding unnaturally as it slid out of the fridge. Its limbs bent in grotesque angles, long and thin, stretching like rubber until it was standing. It wasn't even standing, really. It was hovering, its feet barely touching the ground, as if it was floating just above the floor. I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. My eyes were locked onto the thing that had been following me all this time. It tilted its head slightly, as though it was curious about me. Then its lips stretched into a grotesque smile, the skin pulling back to reveal a mouth full of teeth, sharp, jagged teeth that seemed far too large for its face. And then, in an instant, it was gone. Vanished. I looked around, my head spinning, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But there was nothing. No fridge, no creature, just the silent kitchen in front of me. I blinked rapidly, shaking my head, telling myself that it was all in my mind, that I had imagined it. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't just in my head. I turned quickly, desperate to escape, and as I did, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, movement just behind the doorframe leading to the hallway. It was standing there, watching me. The figure. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, suffocating as I turned toward it. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, its face still featureless, its eyes dark, endless pits. For a moment, I was paralyzed. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Just like that. I looked around frantically, but the hallway was empty. The apartment felt eerily still, as though nothing had happened. But I knew it had. I knew it was real. The phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with a new photo. I didn't want to look, but my hands betrayed me, unlocking the phone and forcing me to gaze at the screen. It was a photo of the hallway. The exact hallway I had just been standing in. But there was something different this time. There, in the distance, was the figure again, standing just where the light from the kitchen should have ended. It was looking straight at the camera, straight at me. And behind it, in the blackness of the hallway, there was a shape. A shape I hadn't seen before. A shape that looked like me. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. My reflection, standing in the darkness, was not just a reflection anymore. It was me. But it wasn't. It was wrong. I screamed, dropping the phone to the floor. My reflection in the photo was slowly moving, tilting its head to one side in the same unnatural way the figure had done in the kitchen. And then I heard it. A low whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. Come closer. I backed away, but the whisper continued, now louder, more insistent. Come closer. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it find me. I had to leave. But as I turned to run, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The hallway was no longer a hallway. It had turned into a void, an endless stretch of darkness, swallowing everything. And there, standing in the center, was the figure. Smiling. It was waiting. And I was never getting out. I don't remember writing the notes. It was the first thing I noticed when I opened my notebook. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, but it wasn't mine. The words, the phrases, the descriptions of things I couldn't place, all of them felt unfamiliar. But it wasn't just that. They described events that hadn't happened yet. At least, not when I had written them. Or had they? I turned the page, my fingers trembling slightly, unsure of what I would find next. The first note read, "Tonight, you will dream of a door with no handle. It will open, and you will step inside. The room will be empty, but something will be waiting for you. It will be watching." I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as some bizarre, half-forgotten thought I had written down in my sleep, but the unease settled deep in my gut. I didn't remember dreaming about a door or stepping into a room. But as I read on, my mind struggled to ignore the nagging feeling that something about this was real. The next note was even more specific. "You will hear a knocking sound at the window. Don't look. The figure outside is not what it seems." A shiver ran down my spine. Just the day before, I had been sitting in my living room when I heard a knock on the window. I had looked, of course, even though the note warned me not to. There had been no one outside, only the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. But what did it mean? How could this notebook, written in a hand that wasn't mine, know about something that had happened only hours ago? The third note was more unsettling. "You will find the photograph in the attic. It will be of you, but it won't be you. And it will be waiting for you to notice it." I couldn't understand why, but I knew I had to go to the attic. I didn't want to, not after reading that note, but I couldn't ignore it. The pull was too strong. I had to see if it was true. Had I really found the photograph? The thought of the attic made my stomach twist. I didn't like going up there. It had always felt off to me, like the space itself was alive, watching. I stood up from my desk, the notebook still open in my hands, and walked slowly to the staircase. The house felt colder than usual, the air thick with a strange heaviness that I couldn't place. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated. My heart was racing, and the words from the notebook replayed in my mind. The photo was waiting for me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't let it go. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The creak of the wood echoed in the silence, and I stepped into the dimly lit space. The attic was dusty, filled with old furniture, forgotten boxes, and things I had long since shoved away into the corners. But there, in the farthest corner of the room, something caught my eye. A framed photo, resting on top of an old chest, glinted faintly in the low light. I approached it slowly, my hand reaching for the edge of the frame. The air seemed to thicken around me, making each movement feel slower, heavier. As I lifted the photo, my stomach dropped. It was a picture of me. But it wasn't just any picture. The face in the photo, it wasn't mine, not entirely. The features were wrong, twisted. The eyes, wide and unblinking, stared directly at the camera, and the mouth, the smile was too wide, too knowing. I dropped the photo, the frame clattering to the floor. My hands were shaking as I backed away. How could this be? I had never seen this photo before, and yet, the longer I looked at it, the more familiar it felt. The person in the photo wasn't me, not exactly. It was like looking at someone who wore my face but wasn't me. The expression was too sinister, too deliberate. Suddenly, I heard a soft noise behind me. A scratching, a dragging sound. It came from the corner of the room, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. No one was there. Yet the scratching continued. It sounded like fingernails on wood, slow and methodical, and it was getting closer. I backed toward the door, my mind racing. The notebook. I needed to check the next note. I fumbled for it, flipping through the pages as the scratching grew louder, nearer. And then I found it. The next note. The scratching will stop when you see them. The shadows will stop moving, but you will still feel them. I couldn't breathe. The air around me seemed to grow colder, the darkness pressing on all sides. I looked up at the shadows once more, and for the briefest moment, I saw it, a figure, standing just outside the edge of the light, watching me. The shadows seemed to ripple, to move, like they were alive. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the floor, the notebook slipping from my hands. The figure stepped forward, its shape slowly becoming clearer in the dim light. But it wasn't a person. Not really. It was something else. Something wrong. I tried to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. And then, I remembered the final note. Once you see them, you will never forget. The scratching stopped. But the figure was still there. It was waiting. And I had no idea how to stop it. I froze. The figure in front of me, though still shrouded in shadow, seemed to be moving closer. Its presence pressed against the air like a weight, suffocating the space around me. I couldn't make out its features clearly, but its shape, tall, unnaturally elongated, seemed wrong, as though the very laws of nature were bending around it. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My muscles were frozen in place, locked in some invisible grip. The only sound in the room was my own panicked breathing, ragged and erratic. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat like a drumbeat of impending doom. The figure didn't speak. It didn't move in a way that made sense. Its form seemed to shift, like it was made of the very shadows that stretched across the room. The edges of its body flickered, blurring in and out of existence, and yet its gaze was unmistakably fixed on me. Those eyes. I could feel them boring into me, despite not being able to see them clearly. They felt like an endless abyss, black, empty, watching. A chill swept through the room, colder than the attic air. It was as though the temperature had dropped in an instant, as if the thing in front of me was draining all warmth from the space. I wanted to move, to escape, but my feet were glued to the floor, my body betraying me. I reached for the notebook again, desperate to find something, anything, that might explain what was happening. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, the words blurring together, but there, toward the end, another note awaited. It knows you. It has always known you. You cannot run from what's inside. I felt the room close in around me. The words on the page seemed to echo in my mind, reverberating like a chant. My breath caught in my throat. What did it mean? What was inside? Was it talking about the thing in the attic? Or was it something deeper, something I couldn't see or understand? The figure in front of me took another step forward, its movement slow and deliberate. As it moved, The shadows around it seemed to stretch and writhe, reaching toward me like tendrils of darkness. The closer it came, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing in on me from all sides. I tried to move again, tried to scream, but nothing happened. My mind screamed for escape, but my body betrayed me, trapped in this paralyzing fear. And then, I saw it. A flash of movement in the corner of my vision. At first, I thought it was another shadow, but no. Something was there, another figure, just barely visible, standing silently in the farthest corner of the room. It wasn't moving. It wasn't even breathing. It was just waiting, watching. I couldn't process what I was seeing. How was this possible? How many of them were there? The notebook hadn't warned me about this. It had only spoken of one figure, not two. The second one seemed even more sinister, more distant. It felt like it wasn't even part of this world. I snapped my head back to the first figure, hoping for some kind of explanation, but it was gone. The space in front of me, where it had been standing just moments ago, was now empty. I didn't know if that was better or worse. But as I stood up shakily, I realized something was different. The air no longer felt cold, but the oppressive weight of the room remained. I could still hear the faint scratching noise in the distance, like claws dragging across wood. The second figure, the one in the corner, it hadn't moved. But now, it was closer. It was closer than it had been before. I could feel it. I could feel its presence growing stronger, suffocating me with its gaze. The silence was deafening. The scratching was louder now, and it wasn't coming from the corner anymore. It was coming from behind me, from the ceiling, from all around. I turned, and that's when I saw it. The first figure had returned. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were others now, shadowy shapes standing in the corners of the attic, watching, waiting. And then, I realized something terrible. They weren't just watching me. They were waiting for me to make the next move. They were waiting for me to make the mistake that would make me theirs. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if something, or someone, was trying to claw its way into this reality. I gripped the notebook tightly in my hands, my knuckles white, but it did nothing to calm my racing heart. There had to be something in these pages, something that would explain what was happening. I had to find it. And then, as if the room itself were alive, the shadows flickered again. This time, the figure in the corner moved. It was impossibly fast, its body a blur of motion as it crossed the room in an instant. I stumbled backward, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then it spoke. Its voice was a rasping whisper, like dry leaves scraping against concrete. "You're not supposed to be here." The words sent a jolt of terror through me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my body frozen once again in the grip of fear. The shadows seemed to close in around me, each figure stepping closer, their presence filling the room, suffocating me with their unnatural weight. The air was thick now, heavy with something ancient, something wrong. The walls felt like they were closing in, the space around me shrinking. And as I stood there, paralyzed and trapped, I knew one thing for sure. The nightmare had only just begun. The darkness was suffocating. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the figures in the corners closing in, their movements too fluid, too unnatural. The air itself seemed to shimmer with their presence, as though reality itself was bending under the weight of their gaze. "You're not supposed to be here," the voice had rasped again, louder this time, closer, like it was in my very ear. My pulse quickened. I opened my mouth, desperate to scream, to call for help, but no sound escaped. My throat was parched, tight as though someone was squeezing it from the inside. The first figure, the one closest to me, stepped forward. It moved with unsettling speed, its form blurring in and out of existence as though it were caught between two worlds. I could see only vague outlines, tall, stretched limbs that seemed to reach impossibly long, and a head, if you could even call it that twisted at angles no human body should be able to. Its face, if it could even be called that, was an empty void, like a mask of pure darkness. Yet, I could feel its eyes, countless eyes, pressing against me, burrowing into my skull. Stop looking at me. Stop it. I willed myself to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. Panic surged in my chest, hot and suffocating, as if I were drowning. The notebook, still clutched tightly in my hand, suddenly felt like a lifeline, a fragile thread of sanity in the chaos. I tried to read it, tried to find something that made sense, something that might explain why I was trapped in this nightmare. I flipped through the pages, but the words seemed to shift as I read them, changing before my eyes, as though they were written by an unseen hand. The ink bled and twisted into new shapes, forming phrases that made no sense. They are closer than you think. Don't look back. It's already inside you. I dropped the notebook, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The words felt like a warning, a truth I didn't want to acknowledge. Something had changed. Something was inside me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The silence was broken by a soft click, like the sound of a door unlocking. I turned, my heart leaping in my throat, but there was no door. No window. Just the oppressive, all-consuming blackness. The figure in the corner, the one that had been still, unmoving, was gone. I didn't see it move, didn't hear it approach. It had just disappeared, like it had melted into the very walls themselves. And then, I felt it. A cold, invisible hand brushed against the back of my neck, sending a wave of icy dread down my spine. I spun around, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but there was nothing there. No one. It's not real. It can't be real. I told myself that over and over, but the growing sense of dread, the weight pressing in on me, told me otherwise. I felt like I was being watched from all directions, even though the room was empty. But no, it wasn't empty. I wasn't alone. From behind, I heard the faintest of whispers. So soft, I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but it was there. You're still here. Still trapped. The voice was different this time. It was more familiar, almost like it was speaking from inside my own head. My legs gave way, and I collapsed to the floor, my body shaking with fear. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Something was in the room with me, something that had been there the whole time, just waiting, watching, whispering. And then, I remembered something. The notebook. I hadn't read the last page. Frantically, I scrambled to find it, my fingers trembling as they flipped through the pages. The ink was still shifting, but something on the last page caught my eye. The words, though scrambled, were clearer now. It knows you. It knows everything about you. It's been inside you all along. A chill ran through me. How could that be? The words felt wrong, too wrong. How could something know me, know things I hadn't told anyone? The deep fear inside me bubbled up, and I realized with growing horror that the answer was right in front of me. The thing in the room, the thing that had been watching me, it wasn't just a shadow. It was a part of me. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. I was no longer sure where I ended and the thing began. The boundaries were blurring. My mind was unspooling. I had to get out. I had to escape. But how? The room, the very air was thick with it, suffocating. I could feel it closing in. The walls seemed to pulsate with a life of their own, bending inward. The corners of the room stretched, distorted, as though they were trying to swallow me whole. I stumbled to my feet, the world spinning around me. My head was spinning. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, now mixed with an undercurrent of guttural growls, like something trying to speak, something monstrous, hidden in the dark. You can't run. You can't hide. We've always been here. I stumbled backward, my hand searching desperately for the door. But there was no door. No way out. The room had changed. I looked down at the notebook again. The last line was still there, haunting me. It's too late. A sharp pain flared in my chest, and for the first time, I noticed the shadow moving behind me, the figure that had been there all along. It was finally coming for me. No! I slammed my hand into the wall, desperate to wake up, to break free of this nightmare. But nothing happened. The room continued to pulse, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. I turned, and there it was, its dark form emerging from the corner, crawling toward me like something that was never meant to walk this earth. The figures were coming. They were inside my mind. And there was no escape. I could feel the walls pressing against me, tightening like the grip of a vice. My lungs struggled to expand, the air thick with an oppressive weight that crushed every breath I tried to take. My body trembled, the sensation of being surrounded by something unseen, something alive, only growing stronger. It's too late. The words echoed in my mind, repeating like a mantra, a truth I didn't want to accept. But the whispers, the growls, the thing in the room, it was real. It was all real. I turned, eyes wild, desperate to find a way out, but the room had changed. The edges of the walls seemed to stretch and curve, twisting like melted wax. The space that had once been familiar was now foreign, hostile, like it had never been my own. The familiar scent of wood and dust had been replaced by something sickly sweet, like decaying flowers. I backed away, my legs stumbling beneath me, heart pounding. The figures were still there, surrounding me, closing in. They moved in the periphery of my vision, never quite fully forming but always present. Their shapes rippled in and out of existence, too fast to track, too unnerving to confront. I have to get out, I thought again. There must be a way out. My eyes landed on the window, just a sliver of light cutting through the darkness. I rushed toward it, each step heavy and hesitant, my feet dragging as if the very ground beneath me was trying to pull me down. The closer I got to the window, the more distorted everything became. The room seemed to shift, the walls folding inward like a collapsing star. The air smelled of something burnt, but when I looked, there was no fire. Just darkness. The window wouldn't open. No. No. I pulled at the latch, my fingers slick with sweat, but the window refused to budge. It felt as though it was sealed shut by something far stronger than any lock. Panic rose in my chest, thick and choking, as I turned around and faced the room once more. The shadows were no longer hiding in the corners, they were moving now, slithering, crawling across the floor toward me, as though they were alive. And then, I saw it. In the center of the room, a figure took shape. It was unlike the others, more defined, more solid. It was tall, too tall, with a body that seemed to flicker in and out of focus. Its skin, if you could call it that, was a mottled gray, a sickly color that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its limbs were long, unnaturally elongated, and its hands, if they were hands, ended in long, twisted fingers. But the worst part, the part that made me want to scream and run until my legs gave out, was its face. It was nothing. No features, no expression, just a blank, featureless mask. But there was something about the emptiness of it that made my skin crawl, like the absence of a face was far more terrifying than any grotesque detail could be. And then it spoke. "You don't belong here." The voice was not a voice at all. It was inside my head, vibrating through my skull, a low hum that sent waves of pain through my temples. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head, as the words echoed over and over. "You don't belong here." I gasped, trying to block it out, to regain control of my thoughts, but it was impossible. My body trembled uncontrollably, as if the very presence of the figure was draining the life from me. "You've seen too much." It was in my head now, those words, those terrible words. I had seen too much. I had gone too far and uncovered something that should never have been found. I reached for the notebook again, my hand shaking as I fumbled through the pages. The ink on the last page was still there, still shifting, but now it was clear, clearer than ever before. "It's already inside you." The words burned through my mind like fire, searing into my thoughts, and I finally understood. The thing in front of me wasn't just in the room. It was inside me. It had always been inside me. "No!" I screamed, unable to stop myself. I wasn't sure if I was shouting at the figure or at myself, but the cry was desperate, filled with the raw need to escape, to break free from the terror. But it didn't matter. It was too late. The figure took a step forward, its long limbs stretching impossibly far, and I felt the temperature drop, a coldness spreading through the air, as though the very room was being consumed by it. "You've been chosen." The words, that horrible, alien voice, sent a jolt of terror through my body. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My feet were glued to the floor, my body locked in place. I could feel it, the presence inside me, twisting, shifting, as though it were waking up, stretching inside my chest. It was too much. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure reaching out, its fingers brushing against my skin, sending a jolt of icy pain through me, and then darkness. I woke up with a start, gasping for air, my heart racing in my chest. For a moment, I thought I was still in that room, still trapped in the nightmare. But the familiar walls of my bedroom surrounded me, and the soft hum of the city outside drifted through the window. I was awake. It was over. But as I looked down at the bed, my blood ran cold. The notebook was on the floor beside me, and the words on the last page weren't shifting anymore. They were clear, as if they had been written in stone. "It's inside you." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing in on me as I stared at the notebook on the floor. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could feel the sweat trickling down the back of my neck. The words on the last page were seared into my mind, burning like a brand. "It's inside you." I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something far beyond the terror I'd felt in the nightmare. I forced myself to move, reaching for the notebook with trembling hands. My fingers brushed against the cover, and I recoiled, as if it were made of ice. I picked it up, but I couldn't open it. My mind screamed at me to stop, to throw it away, to never touch it again. But something was pulling me toward it, some compulsion I couldn't fight. I flipped open the notebook, eyes desperately scanning the pages. I had to know, had to understand what was happening. The pages were filled with scribbles, words written in a frantic scroll, just like before. My eyes locked onto the last entry, the one that had burned into my soul. It's inside you. My stomach lurched, and I felt the blood drain from my face. The handwriting was mine, no doubt about it, but it was different. This wasn't just writing, it was a command, a curse, something written with intent, with purpose. I closed my eyes, trying to clear the fog in my mind. But when I opened them, I saw something, someone moving in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, some lingering trace of the nightmare. But then it moved again, slowly, purposefully, as if it knew I was watching. A figure. A tall, shadowy figure, standing at the edge of the room, blending into the darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, thick and suffocating, like it was waiting for something. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. The figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. It was there, and it wasn't going anywhere. I stumbled backward, dropping the notebook as I pushed myself up from the bed. My legs were shaking, my body trembling with fear. The room seemed to spin as I turned toward the door, desperate to escape, to run away from the creeping sense of dread that had followed me from my dreams. But the door wouldn't open. I pulled at the handle, my fingers slick with sweat, but the door remained firmly shut. It was like something was holding it, keeping it closed, trapping me inside. My heart raced as I realized the truth. I was stuck. The figure in the corner took a step forward, its silhouette now more defined, more real. It was taller than I remembered, unnaturally tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and twitch. I could feel its gaze on me, even though I couldn't see its face. I turned to the window, but the glass was fogged, as though it had been covered in a thick layer of mist. I pressed my hands against it, but it was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been. I turned back to the figure. It was closer now, almost within arm's reach. My breath caught in my throat as I saw its eyes, or rather, where its eyes should have been. There were none. Just empty, black sockets that seemed to pull me in, like I was being swallowed by an endless void. I could feel the darkness reaching out to me, enveloping me, consuming me. And then, in the stillness of the room, I heard it. "You've been chosen." The voice, that awful, hollow voice, echoed through my mind. It was no longer just in my head, it was coming from the figure itself. I could feel its coldness, its malice, wrapping around me, tightening like a noose. "You belong to us." The words were like poison, seeping into my veins, spreading through my body. I could feel the coldness creeping into my bones, like ice was replacing my blood. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but my body wouldn't move. My arms and legs felt heavy, like they weren't mine anymore. "It's inside you." I heard the words again, clearer now, coming from somewhere deep inside me. They weren't just coming from the figure anymore, they were coming from within me, as though I had been the one writing them all along. Suddenly, I realized the horrifying truth. The figure wasn't just in the room with me. It wasn't just haunting my mind. It was part of me. It always had been. It had been inside me all along. I tried to move, tried to fight, but it was useless. The presence inside me was too strong, too overwhelming. I could feel it pulling me, forcing me to obey, to succumb to its will. "You can't escape." The words echoed in my head, over and over, until they drown out everything else. My thoughts, my fears, my screams, they all faded into the void, consumed by the thing that had been waiting for me, watching me, all along. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure, its empty eyes staring into mine. And then, everything was gone. And I knew, deep down, I knew that there would be no waking up from this. Not this time. I woke up again, but it wasn't the same. The air felt different, colder. The room was darker. I could feel it. The presence was still there. The notebook was on the floor next to me, open to a page I didn't remember writing. It's too late. It's already inside you. I closed my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't need to look. I already knew. It was real. All of it. And now, there was no escaping. Not anymore. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.